It was quite a late evening when the sun had already begun to set over the horizon. Many different people had gathered around one estate. These people were standing and talking loudly about something. One of the residents said that first there was tax evasion, then even a conspiracy. Another person agreed and said that even though they are the Lombardi family, they cannot escape punishment for betrayal. People could not believe that people with such a long history could actually act in such a way. However, a girl with beautiful red hair who was hiding in the crowd heard this and said that they were all idiots. She considered them truly brainless and even lazy, and even a fire would not make them move. She had already said many times that the first prince was nothing special, and that there was no way this idiot and terrible person could become the crown prince. She said all this, however, in the end, no one listened to her. In fact, these Lombardi. It was the world tree on the coat of arms, a name that is synonymous with eternal prosperity. It was also the family that brought the first emperor to the throne, so it can be said without embellishment that in history the Lombardi were the history of the empire itself. He accumulated quite a large amount of wealth through his influence, including through wars, as well as art and the development of culture throughout the empire. Lombardi left his undeniable mark all over the world, which would be difficult to erase even after centuries. The imperial family, feeling threatened by them, gave orders to limit the powers of the family after Rulok Lombardi took over its leadership. However, Rulok immediately invented the grant system, and, without separating aristocrats and commoners, produced excellent specialists. And it was precisely these same specialists who then touched upon all areas of activity and also occupied high positions. Thus, in the end, the previous emperor himself canceled the order he had given, and this was the case for quite a long time. However, at some point, everything changed. This beautiful young girl with red hair was so angry that she even punched the wall. She didn't understand how it was possible to dry out such a mouth in just 2 years, even though they were truly real idiots. In fact, the reason for her anger was quite simple, because she too was from the Lombardi family for some time. It was a little girl who lived in South Korea and died in a car accident. And because of that, when she first opened her eyes in the body of a baby, she was very shocked. As soon as she woke up, she gave an enthusiastic cry of joy that she was born with a golden spoon in her mouth. At least that's what she thought at first. Only she found out that she was very much mistaken. Her father, Gallagher Lombardi, was the third son of the previous head of the family, and this is quite a prestigious title. Well, her mother, who died in childbirth, was a commoner, and she was not recognized as his official bride. But the girl who was born to them still received love from her father and the surname Lombardi with the permission of her grandfather. However, she remained an illegitimate child and could not hope for anything more. Obstacles always awaited her on the way, and after her father passed away a few days before her 11th birthday, they gradually began to forget everything around them. And all because there was no one else to take care of her. There was simply no one else, but the girl, of course, could not stay on the sidelines forever. And it was for this reason that when she was already 15 years old, she began to work for the family. Her persistence was truly the most important driving force in this whole difficult process. Well, fortunately, her skills weren't that bad either. And so little by little, she gained more and more importance in the estate. And when she came of age, she was already in full control of the Lombardi family's economy. A year later, she was helping her grandfather with his duties when he became quite seriously ill and could no longer do anything. But on her way, there were also obstacles, and these obstacles were her father's impudent and incompetent brothers, as well as cousins who were the most common trash. Every day the girl only had to but could not enjoy any of her privileges. She would be lying if she even said that it was not hard for her at all. However, at least a little confidence was conveyed to her by her grandfather, who occasionally woke up throughout the day. And then one fine day, when he was conscious, he turned to his granddaughter and said that if he had only found out a little earlier that he had someone so skilled, he would have bequeathed their family line to her, of course. The girl was quite strict with herself, so she smiled awkwardly and said that he had done everything right because she was simply a dropout and did not deserve to rule the family on a permanent basis. She asked how she, born from a commoner, could lead the family. No one would like that idea. They would probably even declare a rebellion against her. The man who was holding her hand asked her to stop because Ferencia was also from the Lombardi family, so she should never doubt herself and her abilities. He, as her grandfather, could say with complete confidence that she had every right to do this, so she should never speak badly about herself. He also asked her for forgiveness and explained that he should have been much more attentive to her earlier when she was still very little. This would have changed a lot in her life and in the life of their family. Ferentia, hearing these words, could not even hold back her tears, because this was the first time when they sincerely began to believe in her. And for her, it was really incredibly important because the girl always doubted herself. In fact, even just these words were enough for her. Ferentia put an incredible amount of effort into this house because she truly loved the Lombardi family very much. And besides, she enjoyed following all these affairs, but everything changed after her grandfather's death. One of her father's brothers came to her, collected her things, and began to throw the girl out of the house, saying that she herself knew what she had to do. Of course, the girl, hearing this, was very shocked. She did not understand why they decided to kick her out so suddenly, because she did absolutely all the work around the house and around the empire. However, her uncle said that he only tolerated her because of his father. However, eventually, his patience snapped, and he believed that it was time to get rid of her. He said that she was an illegitimate daughter, and she imagined herself to be something incomprehensible, so she should have understood her place a long time ago and not considered herself a full-fledged heir. Ferentia bowed before him and began to beg him. She said that she would like to stay in their family. She would really like him to also allow her to work for the sake of their entire family, because it was important. The girl said that she was really needed in this place. Without her, this place would just fall apart, and therefore, he could not allow her to be kicked out. However, her uncle only laughed maliciously and said that she definitely didn't know her place since she allowed herself such words and requests. After that, he simply threw her out into the street and told her not to dare even come a millimeter closer to their house. Now she was definitely not a welcome guest there. In the end, the girl ended up on the street. She was not even allowed to take advantage of the right of inheritance that was due to her as a Lombardi. And now, 2 years later, she found out that these terrible idiots just went and flushed her work down the toilet because they dried up their entire family. It was an incredibly great family and a beautiful house of Lombardi, to which she dedicated her entire youth. The girl put all her strength and soul into it, so to see now in what state it was very painful for her. So after she found out what state her family was in and about the protests in the streets, the first thing she did was go to a bar to drink away her grief. People around looked at her with surprise, especially when she started shouting that she needed to support the second prince and then everything would be different. She thought that in order to understand this, all you had to do was have 2 eyes on your head. However, in the end, everything turned out differently. The second prince was hundreds of times more suitable for the role of emperor than the first, who had just spent his time on gambling and his love affairs. The second prince was a Forest of Durili. He was a genius who was despised because he was born a maid. However, after he entered the academy, he immediately declared himself as an outstanding personality. So many people quickly changed their opinions. Forrest, who had raven black hair, was the top student in both the humanities and military disciplines at the Imperial Academy. The political power of the aristocratic parliament, who were the Empress's followers, had no equal and fully supported him, and so the girl was so bitter that she ultimately did not support him. When it was already late evening, Ferentia realized that she had to leave because she was quite drunk. The girl was very irritated by the fact that the stupid Lombardi followed the first prince and stooped to dirty conspiracies against the second prince. And now that the second principal was granted the title of Crown Prince and the emperor fell into someone's hands, they fully felt the retribution for their crimes. While the girl was heading towards home, she was constantly indignant. She called all these people who were now in power from her family because they really were idiots. In the end, she even stumbled a little because she was quite drunk and lost in her thoughts and almost fell. However, at that moment, the hood flew off her head. She wiped the sweat from her face and thought that she was very lucky that she did not fall. The girl was afraid that this could happen. But at that moment, Ferentia decided to look around in order to understand where she was and in which direction she needed to go next. And when the girl did this, she saw that a huge horse was rushing straight towards her, which could simply kill her at any moment. Because the girl was incredibly scared, she couldn't even move from the spot, and eventually she felt a strong pain in her head and couldn't stay on her feet, so she fell to the ground. At that moment, people immediately started running up to her. They tried to talk to her. However, the girl did not hear anything because there was a loud roar in her ears from the blow. In a past life, the girl died in an accident, and in this one, she was even run over by a crew. She was very sad at that moment. Tears began to flow, and she thought that this was too much for her. However, no matter how hurt she was at that moment when she felt how life began to leave her, her consciousness had already flown far away to another place, and her consciousness was carried away to a completely different age after the girl opened her eyes and saw in front of her a rather young man who was standing next to her. She opened her eyes better and recognized the man. It was her father. She immediately spoke to him. However, the man looked at her with alarm. He called her Tia and asked what was wrong with her. The girl at that moment finally opened her eyes. Now she saw everything clearly and distinctly. However, she could not understand what had happened at all, and why she was sitting at her desk reading a book while her father was still alive next to her. Tia remembered very well that she had been hit by a carriage, so she didn't understand how she had ended up in the library. And why was the chair so high for her? After all, when she put her legs down, she couldn't even reach the floor. But what bothered her most was the fact that her dear father was actually sitting next to her, looked at his daughter with concern, and asked if everything was okay with her because she was behaving strangely. The girl could not believe what she saw in front of her. At some point, she thought that these were just minute moments that flashed before her eyes before death. But she didn't know why everything looked so alive and even real. It was very strange. She didn't understand anything at all at that moment. In her head, there was only one thought, that everything had started from the very beginning. So I thought she needed to get out of that place as soon as possible. So she turned to her father and asked if she could go into the room for a while. The man, of course, was a little shocked by her sudden desire. However, he was not a strict father, so he smiled happily and allowed her to do this. He also asked if it was necessary to see her off by chance. But Tia, having already jumped off her high chair, began to run away, saying that she could have walked herself and did not need any help at all. The man warned her not to run too fast because she would definitely fall. She just shook her head and started running further. And besides, she looked around. Then the girl saw a rather unusual classification on the bookshelves. It had been used even before the girl changed it herself. Then she decided to use her excellent memory, because the place she needed should be located not far from the library. That's where Tia started heading when she left the library. And as soon as she turned the corner, she actually saw the guest room that she expected to see. The girl opened the door quite decisively and saw a mirror in the guest room that stood to the side. She immediately ran up to him to check something, and as soon as she saw her reflection in him, she was very surprised. Tia was ready to cry. She didn't understand why she was so small. She looked at her hands, which were shaking with fear, and did not understand why her body, on top of everything else, was also very weak. She barely ran a couple of meters, and now she even began to gasp for breath as if she had run a whole marathon. She was so surprised that she even fell to the floor. Then the girl thought that she needed to calm down and think rationally, because after all, she still had the consciousness of an adult. Tia thought about how old she was. She remembered that when she was 8, she fell and got a scar for the rest of her life. As soon as she opened her leg, she saw that it was not yet on her body. Then she realized the fact that at that time she was not even 8 years old, and this fact upset her incredibly. At that moment, the realization of all this began to come to her. Tia laughed and thought that she had somehow been reborn again, and not into another person, but into herself, but in the past. Then she decided to look out the window to make sure her guesses were correct. And seeing there trees that had been cut down back when Visa headed the clan, this meant that all this was true. These tree seedlings were sent by the first emperor in honor of the completion of the construction of the Lombardi estate. Vienza, who was the eldest son of the family, simply took them all and chopped them down. And the younger uncle Lawrence groveled before Vienza and therefore did not object to such impudence. The girl thought that they were all the same. Her father was young and in poor health, but he was so smart that everyone at the academy took him and envied him. The girl was ready to burst into tears of hopelessness. She thought that if only her father had not died so early, he would definitely not have allowed all these actions, and then history would have turned out completely differently. But then suddenly she thought about it and realized that her father had died of an illness before her 11th birthday. The cure was invented a few years later, and this meant that she really could save him. As soon as she thought about it, hope began to play in her soul. The girl really understood that she could save her father. Her father might not get sick and he would live. At that moment, tears began to well up in her beautiful big green eyes. Of course, it all sounded like something impossible. However, she returned to the past and kept in her head all the necessary knowledge for this, so she still had a chance. In this case, the girl decided that she should be able to protect him like Lombardi. She will not allow the same trouble to happen to her family as in her previous life. She went to the window and decided to go out onto the balcony in order to look at the estate from all sides and breathe some fresh air to clear her thoughts. As soon as she found herself on the balcony, she immediately remembered this terrible picture that she saw on the last evening of her previous life. It was incredibly hard for her to remember the number of people who protested in front of their estate. Her heart even ached because she loved her family very much and did not want anything to happen to them. But Ferencia understood that she needed to calm down because this had not happened yet. so she could change this present in order not to get that terrible future. First, she needed to prevent Viezda from becoming the head of the family, so that he would not make similar mistakes again. Wife of Viezda. Her name was Selena, and she was the mother of the first prince, and Empress Laban Angios was a cousin. That is why he left and supported the first prince, removing his insight with which he could understand that the prince on the crown prince's video was not fit for second place. Therefore, she understood that there definitely should have been someone else who would have supported the second prince, because she believed that this was the right option for them. Then she remembered her grandfather's words before he died, and realized that maybe there was a chance for her to try to do this. Of course, this thought even scared her. However, she understood that they would definitely not make a mistake in choosing a side. The second principle is that the wind would definitely become the crown prince, and this would completely change the whole situation. And besides, she decided that the best thing in this case would be to work ahead and not get involved with the second prince in advance. And if she finds a use for everything she knows for 20 years ahead, then in that case, everything can really change in a very positive direction, so the girl decided to at least just try. Firenze decided to become the mistress categorically because she deserved it like no one else. But in order to make her goal a reality, she had to win the trust of her grandfather. Immediately after she decided to do this, the girl went to her grandfather's office. However, there she met him as an assistant. The man said that Mr. Gallagher was called by the head of the clan and therefore went to the office. The girl, hearing this, was a little shocked and even upset. In front of her was the librarian, who in her past life began working in the library after he retired due to his illness. She also heard that he was originally a famous professor at the academy. So she approached the librarian and asked him to lend her a very interesting book in that case. The man smiled happily and asked what kind of book she wanted. However, he was a little serious because he didn't know what to expect from her. Ferentia smiled happily and said that she would like to receive a book called People from the South. The man, hearing this, was very surprised and asked whether Mr. Gallagher had accidentally asked for this book for himself through her. But the girl, smiling happily, said that this was not at all the case. She would like it for herself. In the end, he gave her the book and then Tia went for a walk along the corridors. She decided to head to her room. However, on the way she saw that she had already arrived at her grandfather's office, so she decided to look in there in the hope that he would not be too busy and would not mind if she talked to him. She stopped in front of the door because so many years had passed since she had last seen these doors or entered this room at all. Well, she decided to just wait for him near the entrance for at least a while because she was still too nervous to go inside. So she sat on the windowsill and looked at the book that she took for herself. Ferentia thought about the fact that she was finally able to grumble it. The girl was really happy because this was the book she wanted to read most of all after she was kicked out of the family. She was very sorry knowing that it had been in her family's book storage all this time, and she had never been able to read it until her death, and because of this, now that she had received it, the girl was truly sincerely happy. She was going to read it incredibly carefully, not missing a single word. However, then suddenly, she heard the voice of some boy who came up to her and called her inferior. Ferentia immediately looked up from her book and looked at him as soon as she saw his face, and also the face of the older guy who was standing next to her. She immediately had unpleasant memories from the past. And all because in her past life these two guys bullied her quite a lot. Because of this, even looking at them was very unpleasant for her. The girl could not believe that she would meet them so early, and because of this, she was amazed. Because he was older than the grandson of Romandia, he always had new mouths. He was a vile slob in the forest, and his brother Exile, who only spent money on gambling games as if they belonged only to him, was not even ashamed of it. They were real idiots. However, now that she saw them, they weren't the grown men she remembered. Now they were just little boys. For a while, she just looked at them in surprise. However, after that, various jokes came to her head, and she simply could not hold back her laughter. Thereby, she incredibly surprised these guys. One of them turned to his brother and asked if she had really gone completely crazy to laugh for no reason. Ferentia. Having calmed down, she thought that she had indeed made a mistake. She could not hold back and laughed as soon as she saw them, but they could have gotten angry. So she turned to them and asked for forgiveness for her rudeness. However, one of them immediately began to behave very narcissistically. In a rude voice, he asked who she was even laughing at and called her a dirty, inferior girl. Then, Ferentia remembered that it was an offensive nickname that they called her because her mother was a commoner. These two were her cousins and thought that they could do anything. One of the brothers turned to the other and said that apparently this is inferior. She got angry, so now she will do something. However, this made them laugh even more. The girl knew that around this time she was scared as hell of these two guys. Their bullying was too cruel and frequent for a small child to be able to endure it all without problems. When the father was indignant about this, Vesdy and Lawrence only shamed him, saying that he took children's pranks too seriously. Because of this, the situation did not change at all. Ferentia. Then she couldn't hold back. She was going to show these boys who was really cooler. Therefore, getting up from the windowsill, she turned to the Villisack and asked how old she was now. The guy, hearing this, was very surprised and asked again, why is she asking him this? But the girl just continued to insist on her own and asked again how old she was. Then she suddenly sighed heavily and asked if he really didn't even know that. The man got very angry and said that she was 7 and he knew it very well, so she shouldn't say something like that. Ferentia was very glad that he finally named her age because she was clearly unsure of this. So she smiled happily and said that everything was correct. She was 7 and he was 10. Then she pointed towards his brother and said that Astyle was 8 and that there was not that much of a difference between their ages. The girl said that they themselves are not grown up yet, and they are already behaving so unculturedly. She explained that it is absolutely wrong to mock a cousin and call her inferior. It is very ugly of them to act like that. As soon as the guy who was the most impudent of all heard that she was talking about her being a cousin and that they were behaving unculturedly, he just laughed and then began to quickly approach her. Then he swung at her and asked if his assumption that she had gone crazy was really true. Ferentia was not going to let this happen. That's why she didn't even start to close her eyes but simply looked at him with a smile. This made him very angry. The guy already asked how such a low-status creature could boldly stare at him, after which he still hit her so hard that the girl even fell to the floor. As soon as he saw this, he immediately laughed again and said that it was very cool, after which he asked how such an inferior person dared to lecture him. He continued to mock her and said that apparently for some reason, she decided that she was their equal since they had the same last name. However, in reality, this was not the case. After that, he said in an angry voice that she was definitely not a lombardi, so she should immediately return to her commoner slums, because there, the same inferior people as she were waiting for her. Ferentia got very angry in a quiet voice. She said that she warned them not to do this. The guy was surprised when he heard this. He didn't understand how after this she didn't start crying and run away. But the girl stood up and looked at him with a look filled with anger and said that she had told him not to call her inferior. After that, she hit him back and hit him so hard that the guy also fell to the ground and began to scream in pain. He himself was ready to burst into tears. His brother turned to Velisag and asked if everything was okay with him because he even started crying. But after that he saw that the girl looked at him with an angry look. He understood that it was better for him not to even approach either her or his brother, because he himself would get the same as him. Velisag, meanwhile, finally came to his senses. He looked at his cousin and said that she was definitely crazy. After that he asked if she really thought she could get away with it, but Ferentia wasn't going to even listen to all his nonsense. She stood over him and looked at him with a serious look. Her curly hair was scattered from side to side. She turned to Velisag and said that he was an extra well-behaved puppy who needed to be taught a lesson. That's why the girl at that moment swung and was about to hit him with the book. She thought that he was definitely a small puppy who dared to chomp on a tiger. She was going to teach him a lesson so that this would not happen again. But at that time, the guy began to push her away from him, and she told him to continue calling her inferior because apparently such blows were not enough for him. Ferentia kept trying to hit him with a book and said that he should have been prepared to get his comeuppance after all he had angered the inferior one. And she asked, did he really hope that she would just stand aside and cry? She continued to yell at him, remembering all those terrible moments from her past when they abused her so much. Ferentia said loudly, shouting that she had suffered too much because of them, and asked if he had even imagined what he had done to her and what she had to go through. The boy could no longer hold back. He burst into tears and began to scream loudly for at least someone to save him from this crazy woman. The people who were in the grandfather's office began to leave, and he himself came out to this noise because it was preventing them from holding meetings. The man immediately asked what had happened. At that time, Ferenti's father, seeing his daughter beating her cousin, was very surprised. The girl turned around in the meantime and saw her dad. She stopped for a while and even stopped pulling her cousin by the hair. At the same time, the father of the Willis screamed loudly. He ran up to him and immediately began to scream at him, after which he threw the girl away and worried about his child. At that very moment, the father himself came up to her, began to hug her tightly and asked if everything was okay with her. He was really worried about her and could not believe that this had happened. Velisag at the same time also ran up to his father and began to hug him. He continued to scream, and the girl looked at him with contempt. I don't understand. Does he really have no pride and continues to scream like that? He screamed so loudly as if something was broken, but in fact it was not so. At the same time, the man who began to calm his son said that the girl should immediately apologize to him because she had offended him. Ferentia. Of course she wasn't going to do this. She continued to sit in her father's arms and even demonstratively turned away from them, not even wanting to look. The man then ran up to her and was about to hit her and said that she was an arrogant idiot. The girl's father immediately turned to his brother and told him not to come closer because he understood the danger. But at that very moment, the gaoler came out of the office. He shouted at them all and asked if they were going to finally calm down. This voice scared them all to death. Then they froze in place and finally there was silence around. When the man made sure that everything was quiet around him, he turned to the waiter and asked him to tell him what had happened, since he was the only one who was not involved in this whole situation. The boy didn't know what to do. He was very scared because he didn't really like the whole situation, so he just hid behind his father and didn't say anything. However, his father in the meantime told Ostel to tell everything to his grandfather because it was really important. He also asked the boy not to be afraid. I stutter. The boy said that he and his brother were just walking, and the Ferenzi suddenly attacked them. He looked at the girl and even started to shed fake tears. He said that she kicked her brother with her foot, and he immediately fell down, and then she also started to hit him with a book several times. As soon as the girl heard this, she became very angry, because of course it was all untrue. She could not understand why he suddenly decided that he dared to say such nonsense. Of course, to tell the facts in such a way, given that they themselves were to blame for everything, was very low on the part of the outsiders. And the girl could not believe that they had really stooped to such a level. Then she looked at her grandfather and tried to understand whether he believed all this, because it was complete nonsense and untruth. For a while, the man looked at his granddaughter. But after that, he turned to Ostela and asked if it was really true that Ferentia just started beating them for no reason. The guy with a trembling voice already wanted to say something. However, she didn't have time because from behind she heard his brother's voice, who said that she always hated them and tried to cause some harm. Grandfather then looked angrily at Velisak. He told him not to butt into other people's conversations and asked why he hadn't yet learned this basic norm of decency. As soon as the boy saw his stern look and voice, he even shuddered with fear. The guy did not understand at all what was happening and why his grandfather was so angry with him. At that moment, he couldn't even contain his emotions and burst into loud tears, hugging his father again. Ferentia, who was watching all this from the outside, was very shocked. She thought that Velisak was a very stupid grandfather, because he hated it most of all when people interfered with someone else's dialogue, and for some reason he did just that. Meanwhile, the grandfather looked closely at the girl and asked if she wanted to try to talk about this whole situation, because he wanted to hear the opinions of all parties. Ferentia. She didn't expect that he would ask her to. She even became a little embarrassed. She hugged her father tighter and was silent for a while. In fact, if it were the old her, she would have run away a long time ago, because the illegitimate child of a crybaby with a huge number of fears was definitely not needed by anyone. And this is exactly the kind of girl she was that made her doubt herself even more. Then her father looked at her and already wanted to say that she didn't have to do it if she didn't want to. But she wasn't going to give in to her fears. Therefore, when she stood up on her feet, she kicked her foot and told her grandfather that she was not guilty of anything. The girl thought that now everything would definitely be different and she would not allow everything to happen like in the past again. Will, who was the father of Velisak, began to shout at the girl. He asked how she could say such a thing. She had brought his son to such a state. And now she had decided to lie to them all brazenly in their faces. But the Halager interrupted him. He loudly shouted at his son. Thus the guy realized that he crossed the line when he started him up. Ferentia. At the same time, she noticed that he had just made the same mistake as his son, but he didn't care about it. The girl thought that the apple certainly doesn't fall far from the tree, and for this reason, both the son and the father were such terrible people. Then she said that she would like to explain the whole situation as it really was, and the girl said that she was just waiting in this place for her dad until he got free from the meeting. Well, then suddenly Velisak and Ostel came and they started laughing at her and calling her inferior. Of course, she asked them not to do that because she didn't like it, and she thought it was very rude. However, instead, without even listening to her request, they simply took and hit her. As soon as the grandfather heard that someone had hit her, he was very surprised and immediately turned to the girl and asked who exactly did it. Did they really decide to do this together? Ferentia sighed heavily and said that the man who hit her was Velisak. He called her the lowest creature. He told her to get out to the common people's slums. As soon as the girl's father heard this, he was sincerely shocked. Mentally, she asked him for forgiveness and wanted him to be patient a little longer until the whole situation was finally resolved. Now she simply had to reveal how she was being treated in this estate and how rotten these guys had been since childhood. Then the grandfather asked if this was the reason why she decided to raise her hand against Velasak. Ferentia said that it was not so at all. She hit him because he told her that she was not a lombardi. Of course, she knew that she was inferior. However, even despite this, she knew for sure that she was from this family. Her mother was never able to get permission for the surname Lombardi, and so Ferentia was not going to deny the fact that she was only half in this family. The girl also said that she believed that she deserved the name of her family since even her grandfather had recognized it. In her past life, she actually ran the house and painfully realized that the fact of her existence did not mean that she was inferior. This last name suited her hundreds of times more than those idiots who only bullied everyone else but her and thought that it would help them. But in fact, they simply ruined the title of their family. She realized that she was no less a Lombardi than anyone else, and perhaps in some ways she even deserved the name more than her siblings. After a short silence, the grandfather turned to her and asked if this meant that she hit him, not because he called her a beast, but because he said that she was not from their family. Ferentia Gordo raised her head and told her grandfather that everything was exactly like that. And she also said that she did it because he was thus denying the fact that she was his majestic granddaughter. The man looked at her sternly for a while, but the girl didn't care. She could easily withstand his gaze because she knew exactly what he was thinking about her. Then suddenly her grandfather asked some rather interesting questions. He asked if her knees hurt because he saw that she had dirt in that area on her dress, and this appeared because of the blows. Ferentia replied that of course they hurt because she fell to the ground, and it was really very painful and unpleasant. Grandfather then began to smile proudly and asked if she really didn't start crying even after that. He also said that he had heard that she had always been a crybaby in life. Ferentia smiling, she replied that she would certainly cry. But after she said everything she wanted, she would go to your room, and there she would calmly cry and feel sorry for herself so that no one else would see it. As soon as Gallagher heard such adult thoughts from such a little girl, he was incredibly shocked. However, after that, he suddenly laughed out loud, realizing the absurdity of this situation. His sons immediately looked at their father in surprise. They did not understand why he suddenly laughed. But the father of Ferentia turned to the Galager, and asking for forgiveness, he said that he believed that he should have taken care of Tia's wound, so he asked if he could leave for a while. Grandfather, of course, did not object to this. He said that everything was correct and the wound needed to be treated well. Therefore, he could go, but the girl suddenly stopped and asked them to stay for a second longer. After that, she ran to the place where she left her book during the fight and, taking it in her hands, bowed before her grandfather. She said that it was impossible to throw the book away. Therefore, it was necessary to take it with her. After that, she turned to her father and said that they could leave then. Meanwhile, Gallagher noticed her choice of book and asked in surprise if she had really taken it from the library herself. She replied that this was indeed the case and also asked for forgiveness. Grandfather, hearing this, was very surprised and immediately asked why she had suddenly started to change. Ferentia lowered her head and explained that she treated her very badly. The book was needed to gain knowledge and not to beat people. She was well aware of the fact that it was definitely impossible to cause harm with a book, and for this reason she was incredibly sorry that she had sunk to such a level. But then suddenly the Galler was a little surprised with a smile on his face. He told the girl that just recently she said that she was not guilty of anything, so he does not understand why her thoughts suddenly changed. Ferentia replied that she believes that when you realize your guilt, it is important to admit it as soon as possible and then everything will be right. The man agreed with her and said that this was also true, after which he told everyone that they could really go their separate ways because he no longer saw the point in discussing all these situations. Ferentia's father said that they should go and treat her wound as quickly as possible, but then suddenly he shouted loudly and stopped the Galler. He asked if the man was really going to just take and close his eyes to all this. I continue to scream. He said that the conference did this to his greatest son Velasak, the eldest grandson of the family. He believed that the girl should be punished according to her crime. Gallagher was very surprised that his son allowed himself to make such statements, so he asked if the man really dared to challenge his decision now. Will, hearing this, was immediately very scared. He understood perfectly well what problems he would now have. He said that of course he did not question his father's decision. He simply wanted to achieve justice. Gallagher, returning to his office, replied that he did not want to listen to anything more and therefore put an end to this situation. He told his dreams to stop worrying about it so much and get back to their duties. Will was very angry. He immediately turned to his brother and already wanted to say something, but did not have time. Ferentia's father hugged his daughter and said that this was the father's will, so they should accept her. So after asking him for forgiveness, he bowed and began to leave. Will was incredibly angry. He couldn't believe that they actually did this to him. But before leaving, Adam also turned to his brother and asked if he was taking childish pranks too seriously. As soon as they heard this, they were very shocked, and Will even wanted to continue this argument. But Adam was not going to tolerate all this. Therefore, he looked at his daughter and went into the room to treat her wound and finally calm her down. Ferentia, meanwhile, was lying in her father's arms and was really very happy. She loved the smell of her dad and had long since forgotten about him. She felt good to be in his soft embrace again and feel the love he was giving off. Soon after they arrived at the office, the man immediately called the doctor there so that he could say with his professional gaze whether everything was okay and also treat anything if anything. The doctor looked at TU carefully and treated her knees, and at the same time the father was very worried all the time. He thought that some kind of scar could even remain, and because of this, he was very anxious. Ferentia thought that if everything had gone as in her past life, she would have received a scar in this place at the age of 8. Of course, she didn't like the fact that something in common with her past life was appearing again. However, she certainly couldn't avoid this. The girl believed that she hadn't broken anything, so she wasn't going to worry too much about it. Then the doctor, having finished treating her wound, asked if she had any pain anywhere else. The girl then pointed to her hand, which was also slightly damaged, and said that she also felt pain on her wrist. In fact, when Will pushed her, she fell incorrectly on the floor, a large adult pushing a small child with all his strength. This was incredibly strange and incorrect for her. Because of this, she was even more angry at her uncle. However, she believed that nothing could be taken from such a low and petty person as he, so she was not going to waste her nerves on this person for long. She simply decided to forget about everything and move on in her wonderful life. The doctor carefully examined her wrist and said that, judging by the degree of swelling, it was not broken. However, for some time it was better for her to take care of herself and be very careful. So he told Adam that he would give them a special ointment that needed to be applied correctly, and then it would definitely heal soon. The man was incredibly sad because he was very worried about the well-being of his daughter. However, he thanked Dr. Amali and said that he would like to talk to his daughter alone and asked if he could come out. Dr. Melly smiled happily and said that he had just finished, so there were no problems after that. He said that he would be in the lab if he was suddenly needed again. The man thanked him. After the doctor left the door, Adam addressed his daughter in a very serious voice. It was clear that he was a little worried. However, putting his hand on the girl's knees, he asked why she didn't immediately tell her dad that they were torturing her, and that this was not the first time such a situation had happened. Ferentia, seeing his restless look, immediately realized that he would really start blaming himself if something happened. She noticed that his eyes were exactly the same color as hers. She had already forgotten how brightly they sparkled. Finally, after a short silence, she said that they talked about how they would beat her more often if she told anyone about it. Of course, Ferentia was very scared of this and for this reason did not tell anyone. Adam, hearing this, was sincerely amazed. He had already gotten to his feet and was ready to go there in order to beat up these guys even on his own, because they were definitely wrong. However, she calmed her dad down and said that there was nothing wrong with it. That day she beat him up badly, so she believed that her brother would definitely never do or say anything like that again, so he didn't have to worry. Adam, hearing these words, really calmed down a little. He now knew that his daughter could stand up for herself, and he liked this fact. Ferentia continued speaking in the meantime. She said that she had endured until now. However, she would not allow this to happen again. She would beat them back if necessary, but if even after this they don't understand anything, then in that case she will run and cry to the adults, because in her opinion, this is how everything should have worked. She also told her dad that he definitely shouldn't worry so much. She was fine and definitely safe if something like that happened to her. She would definitely tell him, because she understood how dangerous it could be. Adam, hearing this, immediately hugged the girl and said that everything was right. That's exactly what she should do. Now, he was at least a little calmer. After that, he turned to the girl and said that he was a little alarmed by the fact that she began to call him father, because it was somehow too rude, and asked her to call him daddy as always. Ferentia, hearing this, was a little surprised. She immediately realized that at that age she really did call him dad. So much time had passed since his death that she had already forgotten about all of this. That's why she, as he asked, called him dad, and also said that they would definitely live happily together for a long time. She was ready to promise him this. Adam smiled happily, hugged the girl again, and said that this option suited him perfectly, so they agreed on it. Of course, Ferencia understood perfectly well that her dad definitely did not understand the meaning of her words, and he would never understand them, because this time, she would not allow him to die so absurdly. She was going to protect her dear dad and their entire Lombardi family. After all, that was her original goal throughout her life. After everything calmed down, the girl sat in her room and read a book that she had been meaning to read for a long time. However, she just couldn't do it. The first thing she needed to do in the conference was to open her grandfather's eyes and get his recognition for herself. So she thought about how she could make this a reality. No matter how pathetic a fool he was, Will was still the eldest son of the head of the family. And for this reason alone, both inside and outside the house, many people practically already perceived him as the heir. And Lawrence had already become quite attached to him, so for happiness he only needed books. He was not at all interested in governing or anything else, so no one even considered his candidacy. Therefore, the Ferenda was well aware of the fact that in the meantime, she had to conquer all three of these peaks. Her father was sometimes a non-existent third son, because few people paid any attention to him. He was the most popular in the empire, and on top of that, she was also a defective daughter, so the girl understood that her task in all this was greatly complicated. I didn't like it. However, she had no choice. Adam suddenly noticed that she was looking at him. Then, smiling, he asked if she was interested in the book she took. My daughter smiled happily and said that it was so. It really was very interesting. Then she continued to pretend as if she was reading it further, but she herself was immersed in her thoughts. Ferencia's task was further complicated by the fact that she was still very young. Her grandfather, in a previous life, could not delegate the duties of the head of the family to any of his children. He pulled everything on himself until the very end. And that is why he soon became seriously ill. She needed to demonstrate her grandfather's skills as soon as possible so that this would not happen again, because she did not want to see his death either, and also to allow herself not to be considered even as a candidate for the heirs. But the task was very difficult because she was also an illegitimate child and a girl. These weak points would not go away even after she became the successor. Ferencia knew that sometimes they would definitely tie her hand and foot. However, she believed that this could be easily compensated for by the patronage of the crown prince. Therefore, even if it was not for the sake of saving the family, she definitely had to attract the attention of the second prince. It was desirable for her to help him increase his influence and gain the trust of those around him so that he could obtain the title of crown prince even more easily than he had once done himself. The girl knew that if she succeeded, the future emperor would not turn away from the house of Lombardi, who had been extending a helping hand to him for a long time. She believed that they would definitely be able to get along well because she knew him in a past life and, accordingly, could even predict some of his behavior and habits. Ferencia also remembered the moment when the second prince's mother was supposed to die around this time. Some said that she died on one of the days of the rainy season this year. They couldn't even call a doctor for her because of the empress, and that's how the unfortunate woman died. However, Ferenda also heard that the second prince made the empress go through the same thing when he became the crown prince. So she concluded that the prince's temperament was also extraordinary, so she had to treat him with caution. Well, in any case, now this boy has to spend a whole day alone, and Ferencia believed that if it were up to her, she would go to him right now. However, unfortunately, she couldn't do that. For the young Lombardi children, leaving the estate was restricted until they turned 11, so she had no chance of meeting him before that. However, there was also one exception to this rule, which was the permission of the head of the clan himself, so she believed that perhaps she also had another small chance to do this. At the moment when Ferencia had already finished thinking about all this and was about to return to the book, she heard someone knocking on her door. Adam heard someone's voice outside and was immediately very surprised. He went to the door and opened it and asked who this person was, because he was calling specifically a man. As soon as he opened the door, he saw a fair-haired guy who was in a rather strange uniform. He did not understand who it was at all, but the man behaved politely. The stranger came closer and asked for forgiveness, and asked if he could come inside for a short while because he needed to discuss one very important point. Ferenda, hearing a familiar voice, immediately looked out the door and saw that this person was Kiravan. She did not understand what he was doing in this place, Adam at the same time also recognized this man. He turned to Yerevan and asked what fate had brought him to suddenly decide to come to them. He also asked if his father had asked him to convey something urgent to them. Gallagher's assistant came inside and said that this was not so at all. In fact, Kiravan was the grandfather's right hand, and very soon he had to keep records of the Lombardi trading groups. The girl could not understand what could have brought such an important person to this place. The man, meanwhile, entering the office, replied that he had come to see Mrs. Ferentia. As soon as she heard this, she was so surprised that she even put the book aside. The girl could not understand at all why her grandfather's assistant could come to her. In fact, at this meeting with Kira, Ivan was with his boss, and upon hearing that the little girl had taken this book, he was very surprised. Gallagher said that it was true, and also asked him what the guy thought about this because he was really interested. Karevan replied that he thought that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding and that it would turn out to be untrue. He asked his boss if he was sure that it was she who had taken this book for herself. The man then asked what exactly caused him such doubts, because the Galler was absolutely sure that she took it for herself and he had no doubts about it. His assistant explained that the book People from the South is a specialized manual for precise research. He thought that this book was definitely not the kind that Mrs. Ferrante would read. She wasn't even 10 years old yet. So she probably just liked the cover, and for that reason she decided to take it for herself. He explained that the cover of this book was saturated in green color, so there was a very high probability that she accidentally mistook the book for a collection of fairy tales, so he thought that there was no need to make such a big deal out of it. Gallagher replied that with an ordinary child, everything could have been exactly like that. However, he believed that Ferentia would definitely not have acted so stupidly. Carillion, still doubting, asked if the man really wanted to say that Mrs. Ferentia was an unusual child. The man, putting his hand on the book, explained that he had called him so that he could personally double-check it. After this, he said that in the future, Ferrante would also be taught like other children. Having heard this, the man began to doubt the correctness of this decision. I told the Gallagher that Mrs. Ferentia is still very young, and it is difficult for children of this age to even just sit still for a long time, not to mention remembering information that is quite difficult for them and also understanding it. The man smiled and replied that with ordinary children this is certainly the case. However, Ferentia was different, so he did not think that it would be too difficult for her. Carillion was very cautious about this whole situation. He turned to the man and asked what he was hinting at, because he couldn't understand it at all. Then Gallagher explained that her mother was a nomad. She was incredibly beautiful, but that was the only thing that made her stand out from everyone else. He didn't intend to hide the fact that because of this, he wasn't particularly interested in her daughter. However, today, after this strange situation had happened, it seemed to him that she was the one who could properly inherit the blood of the Rulok. As soon as his assistant heard this assumption, he thought that this was definitely impossible. No matter how you look at it, he was just an ordinary little child who looked at the world in a completely different way. But in the end, he still went to the girl's room at the request of his master in order to double-check the information that he was given. And when he stood opposite the girl, he bowed. He turned to the lady saying his name, and Carillion also said that he was not the most competent, but he was the instructor of the young gentleman Lombardi. The man himself still believed that the owner was most likely mistaken, so he was going to prove that he was right. Then he told the hunger striker that he would conduct a kind of exam in order to determine the exact level of her knowledge and capabilities. In this way, he would be able to confirm his theory. He also said that if the results do not match their expectations, then the Halliger will not be able to force her to attend classes even through his order because it will simply be ineffective. He explained that this was all for the sake of maintaining the educational atmosphere in his classes, so he asked Mr. Gallagher to understand him. The head of the family agreed to this experiment. Ferentia, we go in time, also bowed, greeted the men and said her name and that she was very pleased to meet him. As soon as the man saw such charming manners, he was amazed. She behaved like an adult. Because of this, he could not take his eyes off her for some time. Ferentia looked at him in surprise. She turned to Mr. Carillion and asked if everything was okay with him. The man then asked for forgiveness for being distracted. He explained that she had given a perfect curtsy and that he admired it. Adam, who was also nearby, was very pleased with his daughter's success. The girl herself, meanwhile, was surprised and asked if she really did it so well. She said that she simply tried to do it according to the book she had read. Then she pointed to the green book that she was holding in her hands, and she thought that she had taken these lessons from the instructions for the young successors of Lombardi. In fact, the so-called Lombardi lessons sounded like a simple homeschooling system. But in reality, it was not like that at all. This was the first stage of a cold-blooded assessment. First of all, regardless of age, the right to participate in it was given only to those children who were ready for such lessons. Because of this, depending on the age of readiness for these lessons, the level of children was determined. Plus, the age of completion of classes was also undefined. The notification that one could no longer attend lessons sometimes simply meant the withdrawal of this right, and the very last feature of these lessons was the assessment received at each lesson, which was immediately reported to the head of the family. The head of the clan is the best of the best. He carefully monitored everything that the children said and did because it was very important. In their case, such a person was a Halliger. But Ferentia did not understand why everything turned out this way, because in her past life, she was able to get to these lessons only at the age of 9. So she was surprised by the fact that they decided to speed up this process. Carillion then got down to business. He said that if the girl didn't mind, he would like to ask her a few questions. She shouldn't worry and calmly answer as she thought. Ferentia did not object. Then the man said that he would at least like to know some details about the book that she was holding in her hands. He had heard that she had personally taken it from the library. As soon as the girl heard about this, she immediately understood that on that day, her grandfather paid attention to her. And this meant that she had an additional chance for him to notice her. She replied that it was true that she had taken this book from the library for herself and had been reading it since yesterday. When the man asked if he could ask her what exactly the book was about, he wanted to know how exactly she understood it. Smiling, Ferentia of course did not object. She said that she had not read much yet. However, in this book it was written that in the forest, in the south of the empire, amazing people live in groups, and this book just tells about them. Carillion, hearing this, immediately became interested. Then he began to ask her other questions. The second question was, who exactly wrote this book? The girl smiled and said that Rofeli's name was written on the cover, so she believed that he was the author. But he continued to insist on his own, and asked what the first chapter was about. Ferende answered that it told about a man named Rofeli, and he talked about how rumors reached him about those very people from the south. Of course, as soon as she saw his expression, she immediately understood that up until that moment, he thought that she carried this book as a toy. Of course, she understood perfectly well why he had such a thought. There was a lot of boring stuff in this book even for the average adult, so he needs to be seriously convinced that she didn't pick it up for fun. Smiling, Ferentia asked, "Did you really come because you wanted to read it too?" She said that she could lend it to him. She said that she was curious about what would happen next. However, if he really needed it, she could read it later. But the man replied that he didn't need the book. After all, he had already read it. Ferentia smiled and said that it was a great relief for her. The man himself thought at the same time that she apparently had not lied, but it was still very difficult for him to believe that she had actually read and understood what she was talking about. So he said that there were 3 rumors that Rafila heard. He was about to name them when suddenly the girl interrupted him and said that he was mistaken, because Rafila was not he but she. As soon as the man heard this, he was very surprised and immediately asked what exactly the girl meant. But Ferentia opened the book and showed him that moment and said that it was written about this in the preface. The full name of Anya Rofilia is a female scientist and not a man. The man was really confused at that moment and immediately asked the girl for a book so that he could double-check this information himself. He actually thought that such a famous research book was published by a man. However, now he realized that he was wrong. Ferentia, smiling at the same time, said that he had recently said that he had read everything. But it turned out that he had essentially read this book superficially. She even giggled because he had come to check it out. But in the end, he himself didn't really know anything. The man thought that given that a small child could not understand specialized literature, he had fallen victim to prejudice. After he looked at the book, he closed it and said that he had no more questions, after which he gave it to her and said that she could attend the lessons starting next Saturday. However, he also warned that at first it would be very difficult for her to keep up with the classes because she would be joining an already active group. Well, the girl smiled happily and said that there was no problem with that. She would learn a lot of new things, and that's why she was already interested in joining the classes. Even though most of her classmates would already know a lot of things, Carillion said that he was very glad that she was in a positive mood. After that, he began to talk about various details of where exactly the lesson would be held, and also what she would need to know. Adam, who had been standing nearby and listening all this time, could no longer restrain himself. He very quickly ran up to his daughter and began to hug her tightly, saying that she was truly a great girl and that he was very proud of her. Her grandfather's assistant, meanwhile, began to approach the exit and said that he had already done everything that was necessary, so he would go after that. He told the girl that they would see each other in class. After the car went out the door, he immediately thought that the position of the person responsible for training did not shine with prospects, and he was just thinking about leaving this position. However, now he became a little more interested. If this girl were to study there, he was already thinking that perhaps he should stay a little longer. Kirilian believed that teaching this child would be a great pleasure for him, so perhaps he would be able to love his job again. When the next morning came, the girl's father suddenly came to her and asked if she wanted to go on a picnic with him. Adam even prepared a lot of everything that was needed. The girl who had just woken up was very surprised. She asked, "What did he mean? Did he really want to go somewhere so early?" But the man smilingly said that the picnic was a great idea. After all, they hadn't gone on one for a long time. And the weather was just great, so he insisted. Adam also said that he took a lot of her favorite cakes and cookies, so they could also take some book and read it together while lying in the sun. He also added that since they were already leaving, they could stop by for a short while to see Dr. Amali, and at the same time thank him for healing her wound. Ferentia. Hearing this, she immediately understood that he was trying to throw her bait in this way, because he was afraid that she would not want to go to the hospital. The girl thought that her father really could be incredibly nice, and this made her feel very happy. Therefore, in order not to set him up, she happily smiled and said that she had just thought about this too. Adam smiled and said that he was very glad that they had a lot in common. After that, he told her to quickly get ready and they were already on their way. After some time, they came to Dr. Omar, a man who was talking to a nurse, and suddenly heard the door creak and immediately turned to see who else had come to him. And then suddenly, he saw Adam together with his daughter. He was a little surprised and thought that something had happened again. The man happily smiled and greeted Dr. Amali and asked if they had disturbed him too much. The man also said that nothing had happened to them. They had come for a completely different reason. The doctor smiled and replied that they had not interfered at all. After all, he had free time and he was just giving advice to his student who was going to become a professional. He also said that he would like to introduce them. Since it happened that way and they crossed paths, he pointed back at the tall, fair-haired girl and said that this was her student, Asteria. The girl immediately bowed, also said her name, and greeted them. Adam also bowed and said that he was very glad to greet her. But Ferentia ran out of her father's hands and ran up to the girl, grabbed her by the skirt, and she told her father that she wanted this nurse to treat her. Adam already wanted to say that the doctor was Omari, so it was impossible to change this. But the girl continued to insist on her own and said that she liked this sister, so she would like her to treat her. They were about to argue, but then suddenly Dr. Omari said that apparently Asteria had sunk deep into the soul of the lady. He said that this girl was very capable, so the gentleman could not worry about her competence. And besides, he would also carefully monitor the entire treatment history, so there was definitely no need to worry. Ferentia. Hearing this, she was very happy. She thought that this girl whom they say is really capable, she was a specialist who later had to create a very important medicine. Then the girl was seated on a chair and this young girl asked for the mistress's hand in order to examine her. She was very worried, so her whole body and even her voice were shaking very badly. Well, the girl was completely calm. She noticed that her hands were shaking, so she decided to somehow brighten up their situation. She turned to her sister and asked if it was true that her name was Asteria. The woman said that this was indeed the case. Then the girl clapped her hands and said that she had an incredibly beautiful name, after which she said her name and also her father's name so that they would all be familiar. Asterio said that they also have very beautiful and unusual names, after which the girl asked what exactly she had learned from the doctor, because she was very interested. The nurse was a little surprised by this question. However, she said that she was studying medical botany. Ferencia then asked if this really meant that she would also become a doctor in time. This made Asteria feel even more awkward. However, she said that it was indeed true, but she was still very far from being a doctor, so she still had years of practice ahead of her. Ferentia smiled and said that this was all incredibly great, and also added that she would definitely come to see such a wonderful sister again. The woman who was already examining her hand said out loud that the swelling had almost gone down, so it was already possible to change the medicine to a lesser one. Dr. Amari praised her and told her to bring the extract of the Sakus herb in that case. The woman immediately stood up and went to the storeroom to bring it. Ferentia. At the same time, she noticed that the girl had relaxed quite a lot and she liked it because she really didn't want there to be such a tense atmosphere between them. The nurse came back with a green liquid and she told the lady that she just needed to drink it and all the remaining swelling would immediately disappear after this liquid. Ferentia. As soon as she saw her, she was simply horrified. She could not believe that she was really forced to drink this terrible, dubious liquid. She definitely did not want to do it. However, her father turned to her as soon as he saw the fear in her eyes. He handed her some cookies and said that these were her favorite sweet chocolate cookies, and he said that she could eat them after she took the medicine so that everything would not be so bad. The girl eventually agreed to this because she had no other choice. She decided to simply close her eyes and swallow everything at once in order to eat a really tasty cookie afterwards. After she finished, Dr. Omar handed her the cookie and said, "Well done, girl," and that she could give him the bottle back because she wouldn't need it anymore. The girl immediately began stuffing herself with cookies, after which she handed 2 more sweets to the doctor and nurse, saying that they had cured her, so she would like them to try them too. They immediately took it, because the girl could have been offended, and thanked her for such generosity. After they tried the cookies, they praised her and said that she really had good taste. After all, it was very tasty. They talked for a while more, after which Adam took his daughter in his arms and said that in that case they would go so as not to delay him. Ferentia happily waved goodbye to the doctor and nurse Asterio, and at that time even began to smile. She really liked the company of the young lady, and after some time she got used to her. The girl thought that the meeting with Asteria had truly exceeded her expectations. She suggested that perhaps at the next examination she should also contact her, because in this way they could get closer and it would help her. They went on, and the girl thought that at about that time something happened in the estate. It was a rather vivid memory from her past life. However, she did not want to think about it because it was not the most pleasant. At that moment, a carriage rushed past her and her father rather quickly. Ferentia looked back and saw that this carriage had a rather special coat of arms on the flag, and the girl immediately became wary. At that very time, the Gallagher received his assistant in his office and asked if he was ready to share his impressions. He asked how exactly his granddaughter had done on this test, and what he could say in general. His assistant replied that now he understood perfectly well what exactly the owner meant when he was so confident that he was ready to take back his words and uncertainty. As soon as the Gallagher heard this, he immediately asked if this was really it. And with a heavy sigh, the man also added that both before and now his assessment was incredibly stingy regarding his daughter. He said that in no case was this so. He still had something to say to the man, so he asked the owner not to rush to his conclusions. He told the master that in fact, after completing the exam, he slightly felt the servants around Mr. Adam, but no one noticed such genius of the lady. When he stated that he had concealed the lady's right to participate in the classes, Mr. Adams' reaction began with a completely unexpected shock. As soon as the grandfather heard this, he immediately asked what exactly he meant, since he didn't fully understand. But his assistant explained that he was proposing that the lady could hide her abilities all this time. He believed that this would be much better for her safety. As soon as the Gallagher heard this, he was very surprised, but his assistant asked him what he thought about it. The man asked if he really wanted the girl to hide her abilities. His assistant saw that this was exactly the case. However, he could of course disagree, because this was only his proposal. Gallagher then sighed heavily and said that it was clear to anyone that A at home lacked both influence and abilities, but he wondered if the situation was really so bad that the little girl had to hide her skills. However, the man answered his boss that the owner still had a lot of time, so he had nowhere to rush and he could think carefully about choosing an heir. Gallagher nevertheless agreed with this, and said that he agreed to first observe and only then draw final conclusions on all this. He also asked that his assistant, sometime after the start of the classes, report back to him about the results of the Carillion girl, smiling happily and saying that he would do this with great pleasure, because it was quite interesting for him to observe this. Well, the Gallagher said that they had been talking about all this for too long. Therefore, it was necessary to return back to work. He was about to let his assistant go when suddenly there was a knock on the door. This man turned out to be William. He went inside his father's office when he allowed him to do so, and said with a smile on his face that people from the Durak trading group had arrived. For this reason, they moved to a completely different room together with their assistant. The man sat in the hall and waited for the final verdict. Carillion, having carefully studied the documents, asked whether it was true that they were going to sell textiles in the capital, the turnover of which is carried out only in the Eastern District. He also said that at present the Durak Trading Group cannot fully take on such trading activities, so they decided to ask Lombardi to arrange transportation. The man who came to ask for this very favor, smiling happily, said that it was so. But then suddenly the assistant frowned and said that they were going to borrow the payment for this textile from the Lombardi Bank. This really made him very wary. The man who came to ask for all this beamed happily and said that in fact, he would also like to ask them for a sum with a reserve. Carillion, hearing about this, became even more angry. But then suddenly the Gallagher's son turned to his father and asked if he would like to know anything else about all this. Perhaps he was interested in some details. How did he tell his father that he thought this deal was incredibly good for them? So by doing so, he was hinting that they needed to agree. And the sales representative, smiling happily, replied that they didn't have to worry about paying off the debt because he was the head of the Durak Trading Group and his name was Croyton. The man explained that he was even ready to swear on the name of his family that he would never betray their trust. However, Carillion was not so sure about all this. He thought that it was all the work of Angina's. Despite the fact that it was the Empress's family, he believed that there should still be a limit to impudence. However, for some reason there was none. Of course, no one will dare to shake money from a debtor when he comes from the imperial family. In other words, the Lombardi will be responsible for the money and troubles, and they will only reap the benefits. The man glanced at his master. He thought that even if the enterprise failed, the consequences would also be borne entirely by their family. Of course, this was a completely unfavorable offer for them. He decided that the owner definitely could not accept such a terrible offer. But then suddenly the Galler finally decided to voice his opinion on this matter. He addressed everyone present and said that he was ready to entrust Villa to this position. He wanted his son to make every effort to succeed. The guy, of course, was immediately happy to hear this. But the assistant was not at all happy because he understood perfectly well what consequences this deal could have. But William smiled happily and said that his father could definitely trust him. After which he turned to Mr. Croyton and said that they still needed to go and settle some issues. He said that he would like to discuss all the other details in his reception room, while Carillion looked angrily at their backs and could not understand how this had happened, because he had just wanted to warn the gentleman that this was a terrible deal. When he realized that the man was not going to take any action, he decided to take the initiative into his own hands. So he stopped the men and said that he would like to look at the goods first and then discuss all the other details. Also, the Carillion said that everything must be done with consequences. It is impossible to agree on anything without really knowing the goods with which you will have to work for a long time. The sales representative immediately became wary upon hearing this. However, William tried to calm him down and said that it was just their employee, so he didn't need to pay attention to him. After that, he turned to his father's assistant and said that he was just an assistant, so he did not understand what right he had to interfere in such important and necessary matters. He said that he should leave right now, and also before that he apologized to Crotous, because by doing so, he showed his rudeness. In fact, William really believed that this enterprise would be successful and the Angina's family would still be indebted to him. He absolutely didn't care how much money this business would bring in. Money always went hand in hand with power. And this would become his goldmine. He would now be on the same level as the imperial family. This is exactly how he imagined his life. And then suddenly, after a short silence, the Gallagher turned to them. He listened to his assistant's request and therefore wanted to express his opinion on this matter. The man said that checking the goods was a request. After all, it was quite feasible, after which he looked at the head of the trading group and asked what he thought about this. William was about to say something in response to his father. However, the sales representative said that it really could be done. He had just prepared several copies and left some textiles in the capital warehouse, after which he said that he would bring them to them another day so that they could really double-check everything. William immediately turned to Mr. Croyton in an alarmed voice and asked him for forgiveness. The man said that he felt very uncomfortable about all this and that he really regretted that everything turned out this way. The man explained that everything was in order. This was what the head of the Lombardi family wanted, and he was quite capable of fulfilling his will. Carillion meanwhile sighed heavily and thought that this guy was still a moron. And he himself did not understand how much longer he was going to lick the boots of the man who came to borrow money and resources from them. This was truly the strangest behavior. On his part, everything should have happened the other way around. But William said that in that case they would already go, and the man did not object. As soon as the door closed, Carillion turned to the owner. I don't understand how he could have raised such a son, but he even hung his voice and said that this request didn't even smell like a deal. He wanted to ask him to reconsider, but Gallagher said that if it had been Jeanette who had suggested it, he would have wanted to ask the man how he would have acted in his place. Carillion was silent for a while, but then he sighed heavily and said that he should have started with the fact that Jeanette would never have suggested something so dull. Gallagher did not object to this and agreed, but he said that the guy should think carefully whether the game was not worth the candle. Then he decided to offer him a small task, and said that one child always overdoes it, another one didn't care at all, and the third one was too weak-willed to do anything. Of all of them, Jeanette was the best candidate. However, he did not trust her husband, and it was for this reason that he really had doubts. The Galler also said that Chanel was doing well, so he was just keeping an eye on her. After this, the man explained the principle to his assistant that the head of the family does not interfere in the battle of the heirs. This allows for the most effective objectivity to be achieved, and since everything turned out this way, he should at least support his offspring who at least tried to do something. He looked at his assistant and asked, "Didn't he really think so?" Well, Gallagher still suggested conducting another test, this time for Angels and William. Carillion looked at her in surprise and asked him if he hadn't just recently taken charge of placing great hopes on Mrs. Ferentia. The man agreed with him and said that the girl was certainly very smart. However, they still knew too little about her hostile abilities. And besides, she was still too young for all this. He explained that all they had to do was watch her in order to eventually come to some kind of result. He explained that the child's probationary period had just begun, so they could not jump to conclusions. And so, when the next day came, Ferentia was forced to go to meet the rest of the children. She went to the door and thought that these must have been the hardest moments of her life. When the girl went inside, she thought that even if she went in the wrong direction, she could simply turn around and leave, in order to ultimately find the right path for herself. As soon as she opened the door, she immediately saw several children who were talking to each other. The first thing she also noticed was Velisak, who upon seeing her was very indignant. Next to him were Mayron and Kelio, and not far away sat a girl named Larissa. Seeing the conference, the girl immediately tore herself away from her toy and looked at it in surprise. The girl already wanted to ask how she ended up there, but she didn't have time to say a single word because her cousin immediately stood up on his feet. The boy started shouting loudly, asking what she was doing in this place. He really didn't understand how she ended up there. Everyone around immediately began to look around and whisper among themselves. They did not understand why he had reacted so sharply to the arrival of his sister, but they decided from the very beginning not to interfere in all this. Ferentia explained at the same time that from today on, she had to study there, so she did not understand his indignant exclamations. The boy immediately started to continue screaming. He said that it was all a lie. She could not talk about the fact that she was allowed to attend the same classes that he attended. The girl, who miraculously remained calm, smiled happily and said that everything was right. Her grandfather had allowed her, and that was precisely the reason why she had come to this office early in the morning. Velisak continued to shout and said that she was a liar. They definitely couldn't allow her to do these classes for some time. He was loudly indignant, but the girl no longer listened to him. She thought that there was definitely no point in wasting her nerves on this little child. She needed to find somewhere to sit in order to get ready for the start of the lesson. But at that moment, two twins came up to her. They immediately greeted Firenka. The girl was very surprised when she saw them. She did not understand what was happening to them, because they had never behaved like that before. The guys were Kilyu and Mayron. In their past life, they didn't care about her at all. That's why she didn't understand what had gotten into them. Since they decided to approach her and talk on the very first day, one of them greeted Ferentia and asked if it was true that she had fought with the Willisak, and that she had even been able to defeat him. Velisak, who heard this, was very irritated and offended. It really hurt his feelings. He immediately began to shout that this was all completely wrong and these rumors that they heard were untrue. But the boys continued to ask her about how she was able to win, and also why he was beaten and with what. Ferentia just stood there and didn't answer. She didn't understand at all what was happening there and why everything was completely different. But in the end, their awkward atmosphere was diluted by the teacher who just happened to enter the office. When Carillion came inside, he saw all his students and said that he was very glad that everyone was already in their places, in which case they would not have to wait for anyone, and they could start the lesson as early as possible. He told everyone to take their seats because a rather interesting and exciting activity awaited them. So they needed to hurry. Ferentia was very glad that the lesson began without any new problems. However, she did not understand why these two twins decided to sit next to her and so close. Kilyu, and Marin were Shinette's twins in a past life. Not only were these two not interested in her, they never even paid attention to the region. She was like invisible to them. It was even much worse. After all, when Velisak and Astiel beat her, they didn't even cast a glance at her, completely ignoring and turning a blind eye to everything. Everything was very terrible, and she didn't like such relationships at all. She didn't understand why they were behaving so differently this time. It was an incredibly sweet and friendly greeting from them, and it made her feel very uncomfortable. But the teacher said that on this day they would study the basic concept of business. When it comes to defining business, the very first interpretive book had a special name. Ferentia tried to concentrate on the teacher's story. However, she even missed, what was the name of the book? Because she thought about the fact that everything else wasn't so bad. This is roughly what she expected. But in reality, Willie Sack simply lay on the couch and slept the entire lesson, not even paying attention to what the teacher was trying to convey to them. And every time he behaved ignorantly, she thought that he listened to Lombardi in the wrong places during lessons. However, she could not have expected that it was so true. After all, he did not listen to anything at all. But she decided not to pay too much attention to this. She was only bothered by another factor. The teacher could clearly hear the boy snoring. However, Carillion did not punish him at all and pretended not to notice this. He did not even try to wake him up so that he would at least pretend to listen. Well, the girl sat and listened very attentively to the teacher, because this was, after all, to some extent, very important information for her. So she did not want to miss it. And at one moment she noticed that Carillion turned and smiled happily at her. Seeing this smile, she became wary, not understanding why he did this. But then Ferentia thought about it and realized that he was not giving punishment and was not trying to maintain discipline. And he was not trying to interest the children in any way so that they would listen to this not very interesting information. However, she knows one thing, that after the lesson he will go and report everything to the head of the clan, and accordingly all these children will become completely worthless in his eyes. Now Ferentia realized that since it happened this way, she needed to try to prove herself. This could definitely play into her hands in the future. So she was not going to miss such a wonderful chance for herself. That's why she started looking at the board even more attentively and with an engrossed look. She wanted to make sure that the teacher knew that she was listening to him diligently and attentively. Some time passed from that moment, and finally the lesson ended. The teacher clapped his hands, so Villasan even woke up. The man then turned to them all and said that today's lesson was over. However, he also wanted to give them special homework. The girl who heard about the homework was very surprised. After all, this had never happened before, so she didn't even understand what he wanted from them. But the man said that it would be an assignment and the deadline was until the lesson next week. The topic was about a log that had been standing in the middle of the room since the very beginning of their lesson. The children were very surprised when they saw this. They did not understand at all why it was necessary to make some kind of incomprehensible log, theme, and activities. But Carillion explained that it is strong and grows quickly. This tree of life is easy and widespread throughout the continent. The task was to sell this log and get payment for it. They could sell it in any way they could. He said that they could chop it or stab it, or even burn it if necessary. He didn't care what exactly they would do with this object. Only one thing was forbidden, namely using their status to force a purchase. The condition was to sell this tree only to the person who really needed it. As soon as everyone around heard this, they were very shocked. But Ferentia thought that it was immediately obvious how they planned to act, and because of this, everyone was upset, and she also understood that it would not be easy to complete this task. Then suddenly, Mrs. Larissa raised her small trembling hand and wanted to ask the teacher a question. The man smiled happily and said that she could find out everything she needed. And the girl said that she would like to know whether this log was one for everyone, or whether everyone would have their own. The man smiled and replied that this was not the case at all. It was just a sample of the logs for their task that had already been delivered to their rooms, so they could use them at any convenient time, but they had to meet the deadline. Ferentia, as soon as she looked at this beautiful, sweet girl, was amazed that she and Velisak could come out of the same womb. It was as if they could even be compared together. Velisad was very unhappy with this occupation, and he asked why he should do something like this at all. He said that work in which you personally touch money is very vulgar. The guy explained that some kind of sale of things could be entrusted to lower-ranking officials, so he saw no point in doing it himself. It was degrading to his dignity. Ferentia was very surprised. She could not believe that the Seraglio had actually instilled in him a noble model of thinking, and now he was refusing even assignments for his own training. She couldn't believe that he really thought that dependence on money was indecent, even for an aristocrat. However, such a model was yesterday's thinking. Today, even if you are an aristocrat, without money, you will definitely not be able to achieve anything. Therefore, you should always have at least a penny with you. Moreover, the fact that these same angels themselves created the Durak trading group. However, Velisak and his mother still say such utopian things. Then suddenly the teacher smiled and said that in that case nothing could be done. He would have to give him an unsatisfactory grade for this assignment, so he would not have to replenish it. The boy heard this and was very shocked. He could not believe that he would really be given an unsatisfactory grade for refusing an assignment that he thought was unnecessary. He immediately asked the teacher why he was going to do this, but the man explained that there was no other choice and the current task was to sell things and get paid for them. Closer said that he would not carry it out. Therefore, his assessment is not satisfactory. He said that he thought that everything was logical, so he did not understand why Velisak was so unhappy. Well, the boy continued to be indignant. He asked that in that case, Carillion simply change the task. The problem was initially that the task itself was ridiculous, so he believed that it was a necessary measure. Before, the teacher said that whoever could get money for selling the tree and earn the largest amount could even get a separate reward from him, so he asked the children to try their best for their own good. But Velisak didn't like all this, because if he was the only one who didn't agree with this task, then it definitely wouldn't be cancelled. And everyone else was very happy to receive it. He could no longer be in that place, so he just went out, slamming the door behind him. All the children were very surprised by his behavior. However, no one even went and figured out what had happened to him. Ferentia, who silently watched what was happening, thought that this boy was very ill-mannered and did not understand what kind of prophet he could be in the future. But she decided not to dwell on him too much. She needed to focus on her task, so the girl was not going to waste time on unnecessary obstacles on her way. The twins then turned to her and asked if she would like to go with them, but the girl was thinking about her own things and told them to go on their own. In fact, the task sounded really simple. However, if you think about it, this homework was not as easy as you might think. The log itself will not grow to be worth even more than a few kopecks. Therefore, it was necessary to make something out of it in order to be able to raise its value. The girl thought that it should be something that could be made of wood, and something that would be in demand at that time. Of course, it could be rough dishes and toy furniture, as well as various frames, but she should not have had to expend too much effort, so these were very suitable options for her. But still, the cost price directly depended on the cost of the wood itself. The tree of life is used in many places. However, it is an inexpensive and common material. Therefore, the Fermenti thought about what to do. After all, she also realized the fact that she knew absolutely nothing about wood processing. And if she resorted to someone else's help, then the assistant would also need to be paid accordingly. The amount of her income would decrease. If everything goes wrong, the cost price of the product may even be higher than its selling price. So not only will it not earn money, but it will also only receive losses. She didn't know what to do and act in such a situation. But then suddenly a very good idea came into her head that could make the girls work a little easier. She thought about the tree, and accordingly a truly brilliant idea came to her mind that would help her do the job just perfectly. Therefore, getting up from her seat, Ferencia bowed before the teacher and thanked him for this lesson. She also said that she would try very hard on her homework so as not to let him down. After that, she left and closed the door behind her. Carillion thought that she was very inspired and accordingly assumed that the girl had already found a solution on how she could sell this log. It also made him look forward to the next lesson to see what exactly she had come up with in her beautiful, smart head. After Ferentia left his office, she quickly ran. The girl thought that the person who could offer the best price was nearby, and he was in the pawn shop. So she quickly ran into her father's office. The girl even forgot to knock. She just walked in and abruptly opened the doors there. Adam, who was busy with his important affairs at that moment, was a little surprised. However, when he saw his daughter, he immediately smiled because he already missed her. He hugged Ferentia and said that she was a big boy. He also asked how the lesson went and whether she had listened attentively to everything there. The girl happily smiled and answered that everything was really very interesting and she liked it. So she was already looking forward to the next lesson, and she also asked if her dad was busy at that moment. Adam immediately said that this was not the case at all. If she needed something, then of course it would be more important to him than all the things he would do, so he put the papers aside and wanted to listen carefully to his daughter. Then, suddenly, Ferrante turned her attention to his workplace and noticed sketches of various dresses there. This surprised her very much. The man, meanwhile, looked at his daughter and asked what exactly she had come for in the end. Then the girl looked at him and said that in fact she had one very important request, and it was related to her homework that they were given after the lesson. Ferentia asked if he could draw something for her. She would describe in detail what she needed, and all her father needed was to present it on paper. The man was very surprised that she had to draw something. However, he asked what exactly it was supposed to be. Was it really a flower, a tree, or some kind of cute animal? But the girl's request was very different from everything her father had suggested. She said that she wanted him to draw her grandmother. Adam was incredibly surprised by this. He immediately asked again, "Did she really need to draw Grandma?" At first he thought that he didn't even hear her. Then Ferentia said that this was indeed the case. The man replied that they had many different portraits in their house and asked if she would like to look at them. But the girl replied that in these portraits the clothes were too luxurious, and her grandmother's face was incredibly stern. She had already seen them more than once, so she knew that they did not suit her. She explained that she wanted to see her grandmother smiling peacefully. After all, her grandmother was her mother and father, so she wanted to see her the way she remembers her from hell herself. The man was really surprised at first by his daughter's request, but he couldn't refuse her, so he thought about what kind of person he really saw in his mother. Then he immediately began to make various sketches on white paper and said that the last time he saw her was a very long time ago, so he could hardly remember her facial features. Memories of his mother immediately began to appear in his head. He said that she was a very sensitive person and an incredibly kind woman. And after some time, the portrait of the peacefully smiling grandmother Ferrante really came out. It was black and white, but this did not make it worse, but only added authenticity. After the man finished drawing, he gave the drawing to his daughter and said that he was not sure if it turned out well, but he really hoped that this option would work for him. The girl at the same time began to examine the drawing, and seeing this beautiful lady there, she thought that it really was her grandmother. At that moment, her cheeks even turned red. She took this drawing and told Adam that she would go play outside for a bit, and the girl also thanked him for his efforts. The man was very surprised that her mood changed so abruptly, but the girl said that she would be back very soon so he might not be bored. Adam first tried to stop her, but when he saw that she was not going to stay with him, he told her to just be very careful and not fall because he knew how the girl loved to run. Ferentia smiled happily and thought that her father was only worried in vain because she was already old enough to be able to walk calmly without falling. Of course, she was pleased that he was taking care of her in this way. However, she assumed that he was worrying too much about her over trifles, and because of this, it would be too early. Or it would not turn out in the best way yet. However, after the girl ran out into the street, she actually tripped over a rock and fell just like her father had warned her not to do. Ferentia was very angry. She could not believe that her father was a clairvoyant because it was simply impossible to predict such a thing in her opinion. Soon she stood up on her feet and, shaking her dress, thought about how in her past life she had really stumbled and then even rolled into the valley of death. It really was best for her to be more careful in the future and to be sure to watch her step so that something like this didn't happen again. However, she was very happy that she was able to get to the right place quite quickly. So, looking at the city to which Ferentia had come, she even smiled. In fact, behind the Lombardi estate, there was a village in which hired craftsmen lived, unlike the rumored ones who lived permanently on the estate and were given rooms. These people lived at the expense of and were engaged in the production of custom-made items for their family. Simply put, it was a village that was created by the Lombardi for their craftsmen and, accordingly, their families so that everything they needed was always at hand. However, Ferentia had been walking around the city for some time and still could not find the person she needed. The area there was very confusing. The girl even thought that perhaps she would have to ask at least someone she met in order for him to tell her where this place could be, because she didn't want to spend too much time there. Then she looked at her hand and noticed a new wound there. The girl could not understand when she had already managed to get scratched again. Ferentia knew that first she needed to wash her hands. After all, if it gets serious early, she will worry, and by washing her hands she will be able to disinfect it a little. She began to look around in search of a well and finally saw it not far from her. The girl quickly went there and looked down to check if she could get water there. However, she noticed that it was too deep. She told me that she herself could not lift the wind and water. She was too weak. So she thought about how she could get out of this situation. But at that moment, a passerby suddenly came up to look for her. Seeing that the conference was standing right next to the edge of the well, he immediately took it and removed it from that place. The stranger immediately turned to her and asked who she was and, most importantly, why she was standing so close to the well because she could fall. The girl thanked him for his help and looked back to see who it was. And as soon as she turned around, she saw a tall red-haired guy. He continued to swear at her, asking, didn't her parents teach her not to play near such dangerous places? But Ferenzi hardly listened to him because she knew that it was Alfred Jean. In fact, he was a genius sculptor whose talent was recognized quite late when he was 30 years old. He was extremely grateful to the Lombardi who, although belated, recognized his simple carpenter's ability, and as a sculptor, he dedicated his first creation to their family. This work of art was the World Tree. As soon as people saw this beautiful creation, they could not believe that it could really be done by just one person. They considered him insanely talented. The master of dozens of trees was used. He created a masterpiece of masterpieces, the embodiment of the coat of arms of the World Tree symbol of Lombardy. This one piece of work instantly made him famous throughout the entire empire, and Ferentia couldn't believe that she was so lucky, and that she was able to find him incredibly easily. Alfred put the girl down and told her to try not to misbehave again and to play something safer so as not to risk her life again. Then she thanked him, but the man, having looked her over from head to toe, said that in fact it was the first time he had seen her in these surroundings, so he asked if she really wasn't a local. She smiled happily, believing that this was indeed the case. She said her name, and the guy, upon hearing it, immediately became interested because he had never heard such names before. In fact, he looked at her carefully and noticed that her skin and hair were incredibly clean. And from head to toe, she was dressed elegantly and expensively. He could not believe that he could actually meet such a noble person, so he was frightened and immediately bowed before her and asked the lady for forgiveness. Ferentia at the same time asked him for forgiveness for making him worry, and even to some extent afraid that she could harm herself. But the man asked her for forgiveness again and said that he had indeed made a mistake. The girl immediately stopped his things and said that he was not obliged to apologize at all. Smiling, she also added that it was indeed her mistake and that, much more importantly, she would like to ask if it was true that his name was Alfred. The guy was surprised that she somehow knew his name. However, he said that this was indeed the case and asked if they really knew each other. But Ferentia replied that this was not so. They had not met in person yet. She had heard his name from one person. After that, she asked if it was true that he made good sculptures from wood. After all, this man had told her about him thanks to this knowledge. Alfred was a little embarrassed. His face even turned red. He quickly answered the lady that he only carved children's toys out of wood and sold them. He wasn't that good at this business, so it was definitely impossible to praise him. But the girl replied that since he was being paid for his product, this meant that to some extent he was already a master. Therefore, she did not like the fact that he decided to humiliate his abilities. After that, she asked if his creation was really worth the money he was getting. Alfred just nodded his head in agreement. He himself didn't really understand why she was even talking about it. But then the girl replied that she had one request for him and asked if he could make a bust based on the painting. It had to be made of wood. Alfred, hearing this, was very surprised. From the very beginning, he wanted to agree to this. However, he realized that he would not be able to handle such a volume of work. Therefore, he told the girl that people's faces were still very difficult for him. Ferentia couldn't believe that such a level of work could still be difficult for him. And because of this, I even became a little awkward because she didn't want to put him in an awkward position. But Alfred said that of course he had made fat members of his family before, but they really weren't perfect and he wasn't happy with his work. But Ferentia only asked how much time exactly it could take, because the teacher gave them a little more than a week for this, and if the guy doesn't manage to do it within that time, then she'll have to come up with something else. Well, after a short silence, the guy said that tomorrow was his day off, so he should be able to handle it in 4 days if he could arrange it. He could take on this job within that time frame. At some point, Ferentia even thought that somehow he heard her thoughts and decided to calm the girl down. However, she did not voice these assumptions out loud. She just smiled and said that she would be very happy if he finished this work and did it well, and she would definitely pay him for this work. Ferentia thought that she needed to quickly entrust this to him and leave before he said anything else or changed his mind, so she handed him a piece of paper with a portrait of her grandmother on it. She said that he had to work on the drawing and that she was really counting on him because it was a special gift. She would pay him well for his work, and so she really hoped that he would not let her down. The guy was incredibly flattered by her words. But at that moment, he was even a little worried because he really had a big responsibility. However, He was not going to let her down, so he wanted to do his job on time and thoroughly. In fact, Alfred didn't really like the fact that she was going to pay too, so he already wanted to refuse the money. But the girl said that he didn't need to do this because he had worked so hard to hone his skills, and any work must be paid for. For this reason, she wasn't going to even hear him refuse. Smiling happily, Inferencia said that she was from the Lombardi aroma family, who proudly followed the principles of a fair wall, so she would very much like him to accept his payment without discrimination. She explained that it was his legal right to receive money for the work he did. In the end, Alfred agreed. After all, he had no other choice, so he replied that he would make every effort to do the job as she needed. The girl was satisfied with this answer, so she said that she also had the last word before she left. She said that she would like to talk about the jealousy that he would need to use, and asked if he could come to the palace tomorrow and pick it up. After all, she was too heavy and she definitely wouldn't be able to carry it all the way to this village. The guy was at first a little surprised that she decided to give him her log. However, he still agreed, and that was where they parted ways. The next day, the girl was already sitting in her room and reading a book in order to continue developing her knowledge. But then suddenly the twins ran into her. They asked her to go play with them. They talked about how they could lose at hide and seek, which she likes, but Ferencia said she was busy so she couldn't go with them. The boys started to protest. They said that she was not busy at all because every day all she does is read books. After that, they even started to call her bad, because she didn't pay any attention to them at all. But Ferencia looked at them with a very angry look and said that if they continued to behave like this, she would never play with them again. As soon as they heard this, they were very surprised. They were ready to burst into tears and said that they definitely did not want this to happen. In order to find a compromise with them, the girl extended her little finger and said that in that case it could be a promise. Now she was really busy. However, later when she became freer, she would definitely be ready to play with them. As soon as they heard this, they could not believe that it was really true. They also asked if she really promised this. The girl said that it was all true, and also suggested that they secure their promises in a special way. After they shook their little fingers and thus sealed the promise, the twins finally left her alone and went off to play on their own. Ferencia also waved goodbye to them and thought to herself that even despite this promise, they would probably return tomorrow to bother her again. In fact, this really did continue. For 3 days now, they always ran to her on the street and could not leave her alone at every meal. These guys were everywhere. They pounced on her to play with her mother at any time and in any place, but still, Ferencia considered it very strange. She did not understand why they decided to come to her so often in this life. In their past life, they were not just indifferent to Aunt Jeanette after the platoon, they stayed with their father. And once Schultz's castle was restored, they behaved as if they had never had any relation to Lombardi. Then the girl thought about Aunt Chanel. She didn't understand why this woman decided to divorce Buster Schultz. In her opinion, it would be a rather strange decision. You never knew that he loved this woman madly. He was even ready to give up his castle for her. But she didn't have time to think about it, because at that moment her father suddenly ran into her room. Smiling happily, he showed her his new book, which the girl Rada had finally finished reading. Smiling again, she immediately began to rejoice for him and ask him about soon. Ferencia also asked what exactly he had written there, and then Sev sat the girl down on his lap and said that she would definitely like it and asked if she would like to read it together. The girl smiled happily and said that of course she agreed to read it, so they got carried away by the process. In fact, her dad had already written dozens of books before. He dropped out of the academy and was not really involved in academic activities. In the end, everything was limited to writing works in one volume, which were then sent to people on the estate's bookcases. No one bought them, and, of course, no one read them. However, Adam always looked incredibly happy, no matter what the end result was, so the girl herself became interested in what he decided to write about this time. And as soon as she opened the book, the very first sentence she saw there was a man impatiently waiting for the day when he would choose a dress for a ball debt for her beloved daughter. Terenti was a little surprised when she saw this, but the man kissed her on the back of the head and said that he wanted to finish this book by the time she started wearing adult clothes. Of course, his work does not shine with the depth of the text. However, with its help, the Ferenti will be able to find out what styles were popular in the Empire Redmu from generation to generation. He explained that fashion tends to return. Usually mothers were responsible for the dress for the debutante ball. However, Adam beamed with happiness and said that her dad would do everything in the best possible way. As soon as the girl heard all these words and saw this beautiful book, tears appeared in her eyes, but, in fact, she was never able to get to the debutante ball. After her father's death, she ceased to exist. For absolutely everyone, no one even thought to send her an invitation because they did not consider her necessary. She herself was completely focused on her duties. She had no time for her debut in high society. When she was able to achieve at least some kind of position in the family, the places that connected her with her father had long since been rebuilt. And in the end, she didn't have any of his books left in her hands. Because of this, Ferrante was now too sensitive when she saw this book and the attention that her father paid to it. She suggested that perhaps in a past life, he had written her the same book, dreaming of the day when he would personally choose her dress. However, for some reason, she never found it. Then suddenly, after a short silence, Ferrantia turned to her father and said that he was obliged to pick out a dress for her later, after which she began to hug him tightly and continued to cry. The man immediately hugged her back and said that they would definitely sit down together, open this book wide, and together carefully look at everything and choose the ideal option for her. She said that this must definitely happen, but in fact she really wanted him to definitely see her Baltipitan this time, because this is a very important event in her life. Ferencia also told father that she wanted him to choose her dress, take his hand and go to the ballroom and captivate everyone around her with just her appearance. For this, the girl was ready to do a lot. But then suddenly from the open window she heard how troops began to approach the estate. The girl realized that they had finally arrived, so she stood up from her father's knee and said that they should take a walk in the garden right now. She really wanted to. The man was very surprised by her sudden change of mood and the fact that she so suddenly decided to go to the garden. But smiling happily, she said that she really wanted to go there as soon as possible. The sun was shining incredibly brightly, so it was impossible to miss out on such wonderful weather. She grabbed him by the hand and began to lead him out of the estate. Adam tried to warn her to be slower and more careful, otherwise she would definitely fall. But Ferranti was not going to back down. She believed that the time had come to find a reliable support for her dad, so she was absolutely serious. At that very moment, in fact, Carillion was on the street next to the cart that had brought those very samples of fabric from the man with whom they were going to make a deal. He began to examine all of this very carefully and doubted their reliability at all. He immediately turned to this guy and asked what material their fabric was made of. This guy was a little worried. He tried to come up with a good option quickly, but he started stuttering from fear and eventually said that they make fabric from the long stems of the croya. Carillion, having heard about the croy, was very surprised, but then Will suddenly intervened in the conversation. He said that it was seriously traditionally used in the eastern regions of the empire. He also added that the head of the trading group personally investigated everything about her. So he warned his father's assistant that he shouldn't worry about it at all. Will also wondered what all this pretense of being an expert in everything was about, since in reality he ended up knowing nothing at all. Carillion, hearing this, was even angrier than before and looked with a murderous gaze at his master's son and was ready to hit him right at that moment. But fortunately, he managed to restrain himself. Then the sales representative suddenly spoke up and laughed nervously. He said that his ignorance was quite natural. He said that despite the fact that this is a traditional raw material, it was used only in the eastern regions, so it is quite natural that few people know about this material. However, people love various curiosities, so their forecasts for this enterprise were already very positive. Gallagher, having heard all this, began to doubt even more. After all, this was a trading group that was not suitable for trading things. In his opinion, this enterprise was aimed only at undermining the Empress, an amateurish approach. But the Empress could have had enough of all this. He also noticed how his son was literally shaking with anticipation. The boy sincerely believed that regardless of the degree of success, it would help him get closer to the Empress. But in case of failure, he did not understand that he would suffer losses and also incur her wrath. Gallagher was about to tell his son something about this enterprise, but then suddenly a swindler ran up to the cart. She looked inside and saw a lot of different fabrics for clothes. As soon as the adults saw the girl, they were very surprised and immediately asked what she was doing there. But Ferenzi looked at her grandfather and happily greeted him. She even ran up to hug him. Will was completely dissatisfied with her. He said that the adults were working, therefore it was better for her to go play somewhere else so as not to disturb them. Before Serentia answered that, she showed that she heard the voice of her grandfather. And in the end, it turned out that it really was he. At that time, Gallagher asked with a smile on his face. Did she really come to the voice of her grandfather? Smiling happily, she said that it was indeed so. They went out for a walk with Dad, and then she heard the voice of her teacher and also her grandfather, so she came to see what they were doing there. Then Ferentia asked what all these identical fabrics were and what they needed them for. The man brought it closer to the cart and said that it was a material made from a grass called kroy, and he and his uncles were wondering if they could make money selling this fabric. Ferentia, hearing this, continued to smile. But in reality, she understood perfectly well that they would definitely not make money on this, because this whole enterprise was a complete failure. She also understood that they didn't even know anything about the features and advantages of this fabric. And in the end, they would simply be forced to give up everything as if they had nothing else to spend money on. She also knew that Lombardi had to spend a long time making up for the losses he had incurred after this deal, and had to be ridiculed for some time by all the merchants. The girl reached out to the samples of this fabric and said that she would also like to touch them. But her grandfather warned her not to pull so hard because it could be dangerous. In fact, no one will listen to the child's opinion even if she tells about all the problematic aspects of this case. So this role should have been played by a completely different person who, for some reason, has not yet appeared. But after some time, she still heard the voice of her father Adam. He was breathing very heavily because he was running quickly trying to catch up with her. The man, wiping the sweat from his face, asked where she had run off to without him. Ferentia smiled happily, called him closer to her, and said that the grandfather would sell all the products that were in the cart. Adam asked for forgiveness from his father and also from his brother, who looked at him with a very displeased look. He turned to the girl and said that the adults were talking and solving their own problems, so they couldn't be disturbed. He reached out with his hands to take her and said that they should have already left. But Ferencia told Dad to look at this stone because Grandpa said that it was made of grass she didn't understand. How could one make fabric from grass for her? It was very amazing. As soon as Adam heard about this fabric, he immediately became interested in the material. He touched these specimens and said that it was the first time he had seen anything like it. It really was rough to the touch, but as soon as he saw his brother's displeased look, the man asked for forgiveness and told him that he was simply very interested in seeing what he had previously only read about in books. After that, he took the girl in his arms and said that they needed to leave so as not to delay everyone else. But Ferenti didn't like it. She thought that they couldn't leave like that. Her brilliant plan to strengthen her father's position gradually began to fall apart and she didn't like it. However, here the Gallagher suddenly turned to Adam and asked him to tell him a little more about all this. The man, hearing this request, was a little surprised. He looked at his father with alarm and said that in fact he himself did not know much about it. He only knew that Croy was used in certain regions of the empire, and this continued. For about 100 years, the manufacturer of this material is very easy, and there is a lot of it, so common people happily bought such fabric. The sales representative, as soon as he heard about this, was very angry and immediately started yelling at the man, saying that he had no right to say what kind of fabric common people use. Adam was extremely surprised to hear these accusations. He said that this was true. This stone was very rough and coarse, so it was definitely not suitable for noble attire. The guy immediately pounced on him and said that this couldn't be the case. The person who told him about this material said that both nobles and commoners wore clothes made from it with pleasure. Even he did not understand what he could possibly earn from ordinary people who did not always even have money for food. So he turned to the nobles. However, the Gallagher suddenly intervened in their conversation and said that his son had said that the man had personally learned about this fabric. Therefore, he was surprised that he did not know this fact. The sales representative immediately raised his mistake, but he said that in fact it was a very close friend of his who was doing this, and he trusted him as he trusted himself, and therefore did not double-check anything. But the head of the family said that in the end, his friend definitely deceived him. Then suddenly Adam, seeing his upset expression, said that in fact the fabric made of chrome had another significant disadvantage. He said that since the material of plant origin, this fabric had a kind of shelf life, then he lifted the curtain that covered the rest of the fabric and saw exactly what he expected. Some fabrics were damaged, they turned green and began to bloom, and then we will explain that he knew this because the material is based on plant stems, and they are very sensitive to moisture. And since it was just the rainy season recently, the fabric deteriorated very quickly. The sales representative, hearing about this, was very shocked. He could not believe that everything really happened like this. The man understood that his deal had fallen through, and because of this, he was very sad. At that moment, Adam began to feel him because he could imagine how sad this person was. He had no alternatives at all and only had Croya fabric. Then, after thinking for a bit, he turned to the man again and said that Croy is a common herb, so it can be found in nearby areas. For this reason, there should not have been any problem with obtaining materials, of course. He was only guessing. However, Adam believed that if the sales representative hoped to make aristocrats his main clients, then it would be best to try adding flannel when creating this fabric. The sales representative was very surprised when he heard about this. In fact, he had never heard about this before and did not think that it was possible to help the world. But Adam, smiling happily, said that chrome is a very good material. It is light and breathable, which is a very big plus, especially in hot weather. And if you dilute it with flannel, you can significantly reduce the cost of the product and improve its quality. And that is why it was best to do just that. How the man explained that by spending a little extra money on it, you can save a lot in the future on the main material. Well, then suddenly Carillion appeared among them and said that to work with flannel, you need quite skilled craftsmen. After all, this material is not at all simple. He also said that we would have to look for suitable skills to pump up. And in Lombardi there was a guild of weavers. There were plenty of masters there. However, in this case, when adding new fabric, it will be necessary to revise the division of profits based on the volume of each party's contribution to production. The sales representative actually really liked the idea because he wanted to make some money after all, so he asked what would be the best way to proceed. Carillion began to tell him various ideas, but Adam, taking his daughter in his arms, told the father that he really had to go, after which he asked the girl to say goodbye to her grandfather and uncle. Ferentia, hearing this, was very indignant. She could not believe that her father was really going to leave so easily, even though he had helped them incredibly. But then suddenly, after Adam had already turned around, the Halliger turned to him and said that he was entrusting him with this enterprise. The man was very surprised when he heard this. And Willu, of course, was indignant, because he was the one who was going to lead this business and earn a lot of money for himself. Gallagher said he thought the head of the trading group needed someone who was knowledgeable in the area. Then he asked the man himself what he thought about it. The sales representative simply beamed with happiness. After all, his case was not closed and he was glad about it. Therefore, he said that the head of the family was absolutely glad to know about the product that was most valuable. To do this, he approached the house and shook his hand and said that the man was incredibly erudite, and if he could help them, then they definitely had nothing more to fear. Carillion, who was standing nearby, said that despite the fact that he did not understand much in this area, he would also try to help with all his might for the sake of Lombardi. Adam was genuinely amazed. He was even a little worried. The man's voice began to tremble. He said that in fact he had never done anything like this before, and therefore he was not sure whether he would be able to handle all this. But Ferentia hugged her father and asked with hope in her voice if he would help this uncle. She believed that she definitely could not miss such a wonderful chance, so when the man said that he simply had no choice, she replied that her dad was the best in the world because he was just like a savior. Adam. Hearing this, he immediately became embarrassed. He was very pleased to hear such words from his daughter, so he also hugged her tightly. Carillion turned to the sales representative and said that in that case it was necessary to sign their contract in order not to drag it out. He asked the man to go with them because he needed to be imprinted there too. No. Will did not understand how it all happened. He was simply furious. However, he did not do anything. The man simply turned around and left. I understand that this would simply make the situation worse. Ferentia, who had been watching him all this time, thought that all her father's knowledge would help neutralize the tissue defect and, moreover, her uncle would no longer interfere with the matter. She was very happy that everything worked out this way, because the Angenas family would cooperate with the Lombard family, and ultimately no more problems should arise. Will was needed by everyone only because of his position as the eldest son, while her father and Lorenza seemed to no longer exist for them. And that is why the elder brother still attended all receptions in the imperial palace on behalf of the Lombardi. But the heir of their family is always chosen in a fair competition. So everything could change at any moment. If this enterprise becomes very successful, then the invitation from the imperial family next time will come in the names of Adam and Ferenti. And in the imperial palace, there was someone with whom the girls needed to meet as soon as possible, namely the second principal of Forest Dorelli. He had to be there at that time, so she needed to get there as soon as possible. And when some time had passed since that moment, the conference was finally able to pick up her wooden statue. She was very happy that the guy had tried so hard and managed to finish on time. Alfred smiled happily and replied that it was all nonsense because it was a task from her and he could not help but complete it. After that, the girl asked if she could look at this beautiful statue. The guy was a little surprised. He did not understand why she asked this, but of course he said that she could do it. Then the conference looked inside and was genuinely amazed. She couldn't believe that he actually did something like that with his own hands. Alfred, seeing her strange expression, immediately said that if something needed to be corrected or she didn't like something, then he was ready to fix all the problems, and there was no need to pay extra for it. But the girl grabbed the statue and immediately screamed loudly and said that there was no need to do anything else because it was perfect. She thanked Alfred with all her heart and said that he was her savior. The guy smiled happily and said that he should have thanked her because she gave him a chance, and he really appreciated it. After that, he said that in fact all this time he was very worried because their family business is carpentry. He constantly thought, was he doing the right thing when he spent time on such a sculpture? However, while working on the commission for the Firenze, he realized something important for himself. Alfred realized that he really liked this business, so now he replaces his father and works as a carpenter. However, when he has a free minute, he spends it making sculptures. And smiling happily, he also said that perhaps someday he really could be called a real sculptor and he would have more orders. So he was really very grateful to the lady for being able to give him such a wonderful chance. Ferendia, as soon as she heard this, was very happy. She knew that the words about his sculpture having value gave him strength, and accordingly he would definitely not be able to abandon this business but would continue to do it. She wondered how long he had been worried about this in his past life. In fact, despite the fact that Alfred worked hard as a carpenter, on weekends he did not rest, but carved sculptures. He silently found his way and was able to clearly spot the end of this difficult road. So the emperor even personally granted him the surname Jean, which means beauty. Thus, Alfred came to have such an important family name, and eventually the entire empire learned about such a person. So after thinking for a while, she turned to him and asked if it was true that he would like to do sculpture not only on weekends, but also throughout the rest of the time. Ferentia believed that now he would not have time to learn carpentry because what she had come up with for him would definitely interest the man. After this conversation, Ferentia thought about the fact that the evergreen forest that her uncle Will got rid of was not just an imperial gift. It was also a very important place for her grandfather. Her grandmother hated the dreary sight of falling leaves in the autumn, so she sincerely enjoyed walking with her grandfather through the tropical evergreen forest. And even after she left him, her grandfather repeated their route every day. He continued to do this until his eyes became completely cloudy, and he found himself bedridden. And then suddenly Ferentia heard steps. She turned her head and saw that he was walking towards her grandfather's. In fact, she was standing near his office and was waiting for him to return. Seeing him, she immediately ran to him so that the man would take her in his arms. Gallagher was a little surprised and asked what brought her to him suddenly. The girl replied that she had something for him, so she was waiting to give it to him. Ferentia grabbed him by the bottom of his clothes and told him to follow her as quickly as possible, because this needed to be seen urgently. The man smiled happily and told her to be careful because this way she would definitely fall. He didn't understand what was going on. However, she suddenly led him into the office and pointed to the sculpture that she had ordered especially for him. And when the Galler saw his late wife, he could not believe his eyes. In front of him stood a truly perfect sculpture of Natalia. Ferentia would then look at her grandfather and say that it was such a gift for him. Her dad painted her grandmother's portrait, and she asked her friend for such a sculpture. Then the man came up and began to examine the sculpture. He immediately remembered that he really draws very well there. However, he could not take his eyes off this work of art. In fact, in the last years of his life, her grandfather lost his middle age, so he was deeply saddened by the fact that he could not even see his grandmother's portraits, but he loved her so much. However, now, even if his vision deteriorates later, he will be able to remember her image as Da will touch the bust with his fingertips. Gallagher still found it hard to believe that she had actually made this gift for him. But Ferendi smiled happily and said that of course it was all for him, and also asked if he really didn't like it. But the man turned to her and replied that, in fact, he didn't just like her. He was delighted, and also asked if it was true that this gift should have its own price. Ferentia expected him to learn the material for his homework, and that was why he asked such a question. Well, the girl asked if this gift made him happy. Gallagher answered that of course it did. He has many happy memories of Natalia, so he is filled with happiness when they look at this statue. She replied that this would be quite enough if her grandfather was happy, then she would be too. And accordingly, this was the highest price for this gift. Of course, Ferentia knew that she would have many more opportunities to prove herself in class, so she was not too sad about this. In fact, the purpose of classes is not to get grades. Grades alone will not advance one to the position of heir to the family line. And if a girl gets a basic grandfather, then for the evaluation system, this will not be considered trading at a loss. After thinking for a bit, the Gallagher said that according to the rules of etiquette, one cannot simply accept such a wonderful, expensive gift. So he asked her not to make an ignoramus out of her grandfather. So he asked, What would she like to receive for herself in exchange for this gift? Ferentia seriously thought about it. She thought that only a real idiot would ask now for money to do homework. She was going to ask him for something else. She said that since he really wanted to pay something, she decided to tell him about her dear friend Alfred and thereby promote him. It was a chance to become a smoothing link between the hidden lines and the grandfather who valued masters of their craft above all else. Therefore, she certainly could not miss this. And when the next day came, they had a new lesson. The first thing Carillion said was that he would like to see their homework results. The first thing he did was look at and asked what he had done in the end. But the guy turned away from the teacher and said that he had not completed it. Then he turned to the twins and asked what they had ultimately managed to earn. They said that they sold it to October for the servants and got money for the firewood. But in no way did they force him to buy it. They sold this log to a man who really needed firewood. Carillion accepted this alternative, so he turned to Mrs. Larissa and asked what she had ultimately done. The girl quietly replied that she had made coal out of it and sold it to the forge on the estate. She needed to give some money to the servants who helped her, so she had earned only 15 copper coins. The man, hearing such results, smiled and said that it was wonderful. They produced a special product and sold it where it was definitely in demand. He thought that it was very reasonable. As soon as Larissa heard these compliments, she immediately thanked him for this. The girl was truly proud of the work she had done. Ferentia, hearing about all this, was very surprised. She did not think that Larissa, who was usually very shy and silent, could be so enterprising. When the teacher went directly to the girl herself and asked if she hadn't done her homework, since he was counting on her the most, well, the girl happily smiled and replied that she had actually fulfilled it. Then Carillion did not understand anything at all and asked where her payment was. At that moment, Ferentia pointed to her beautiful, sparkling brooch that she had worn that day. She explained to everyone present that she had made a sculpture out of a log and that the recipient had given it to her and was very happy. So he gave her this emerald brooch in return. She also said that she certainly paid the person who carved the sculpture the proper compensation. But then suddenly the Vilissa started yelling at her and said that it was all a lie. He didn't understand who could give such an expensive decoration for such a simple wooden sculpture. He explained that she simply brought her uncle's brooch and tried to deceive everyone. But Ferentia did not react to this in any way. She explained that according to the sculpture's designator, it was her grandfather. Therefore, if no one believed her, they could ask him directly. She herself thought that it was incredibly beneficial for her to realize the fact that he had always considered her insignificant and useless, that she was a simple commoner and did not deserve any of this. Therefore, she would very much like him to continue to think this way. She thought that sooner or later he would be displaced by the object of his ridicule. And now, she wondered what it would be like for him when everything that he considered rightfully his would be gradually taken away from him. Then the Cyrillic speaker moved on to the beginning of the lesson, and after a few hours he finally finished it. The children were immediately happy to hear this and began to collect their things in order to quickly leave the class. Larissa was about to go out the door when she suddenly heard someone calling her. She immediately turned around to see who it was. She saw that it was a Ferentia and said that the girl had done her task so well and decided to praise her in this way. Larissa, hearing this, immediately became embarrassed and replied that this was not at all the case. The conference had done much better than she had, and the brooch was of course also magnificent. However, she said that this is not at all the case, and the teacher said everything correctly because Larissa acted according to the principles of trade, so she did her task very well. After this conference, she asked if it was true that she always reads books, and also added that apparently she really likes to study. She said that it was simply amazing because not everyone likes something like that. Larissa was very surprised by such a sharp compliment. However, she thanked the girl for it and said that she was really very pleased. In fact, Larissa was the sister of the Willisack, and in her past life, with the help of the Empress, as soon as she reached adulthood, she had to marry an aristocrat who was much older than her. However, Larissa, who was then neglected by her own husband, who was even mocked by the servants, and who was turned away by her relatives, in whom she trusted most of all, gradually began to fade away. And in the end, she was alone with someone else's share in the house, far from her family, the Lombardi. Very soon, she finally withered and returned to the damp earth. A fragile girl crying excitedly and babbling that she doesn't want to leave Trumparty. This is exactly the kind of conference Larissa saw the last time. When she considered her to be an excessively refined and weak flower, however, in reality everything was not so, because Larissa is much more reasonable than Velisaka and even two twins. So, extending her hand to the Ferenda, She asked if she wouldn't mind talking to her a little more. She explained that this was only her second lesson, so she would be very grateful if Larissa could help her get her bearings a little. At first, the girl was a little surprised by such a request. However, she smiled happily and said that, of course, she would not be against it. She thought that she had a good chance of raising another good specialist for Lombardi out of her, so she was not going to let her die without a trace again. It was at this time that all the children of the Gallagher had gathered in the living room. However, Adam was a little late. He also took with him a lot of different papers and drawings. When the guy came in and saw his brothers, he immediately asked for forgiveness, after which he asked the wife of one of the brothers where their father was. The girl explained that the meeting with the person responsible for the Lombardi Bank had dragged on a bit, and Will, looking at him with a stern look, said that it turned out that he was also lucky. Adam smiled happily and turned to his brother and said that he was ready to promise that in the future he would be much more careful and would try not to be late anymore. Suddenly, Lawrence intervened in the conversation. He said that Adam had been clearly showing this lately, so he became interested in what the guy was so busy with. For some time, the guy was very worried, so with a trembling voice, he said that he was doing the work on behalf of his father. Although it was difficult to say that it was work, they just sometimes consulted with him, that's all. Lawrence, hearing that this would be on his father's orders, was even more surprised. In fact, he was a little kinder than his brother. The guy also said that he heard that Adam had completely taken over the business project from Will, so he praised him and said that it really meant a lot. But Will suddenly couldn't stand all this. He started shouting at his brother and asked if he had really decided to make fun of him now. As soon as Lawrence heard this, he was very shocked and immediately shook his head in refusal and said that nothing of the sort. Of course, he would never dare to do such a thing to his brother. Then he said that since the conversation had already turned to this topic, he also had something to say in general. He pointed his fingers in Adam's direction and said that he shouldn't have been so cocky just because he got a serious case once, and he definitely wouldn't be so lucky again, so he should enjoy what he had while he could. Adam immediately became worried. He felt guilty before Will, so he asked him for forgiveness and said that he really was sorry that everything turned out this way. He also said that he had never even thought of such a thing, after which he added that if he really needed it, he could immediately hand over this work to him. Will couldn't believe that Adam was actually going to give him back the task that his father had personally given him. He thought that the guy had decided to make fun of him again, so he grabbed him by the clothes and told him not to even dare to make fun of him. The brothers were already ready to fight among themselves when suddenly their sister's voice was heard. She slammed her cup on the table and told them to stop already. The girl looked at the pitchfork and asked him to calm down because her father would be here any minute, and he had created a drama out of nowhere. She asked if he was really going to continue to rage like that, like a child who was pulled down to the rump. Will heard this remark directed at him and became even more angry. However, he realized that his sister was telling the truth, so he finally let Adam go. Well, then suddenly he turned around and started to leave. Lawrence immediately turned to his brother and asked where he was going, but the guy, continuing to scream, replied that everything inside him was twisting from just looking at the Adam. So he was going to go and catch his breath a little in the fresh air. Lawrence immediately ran after him so that he would definitely not be offended by the words he said earlier, so the two of them went out the door. Adam meanwhile turned to his sister and thanked her for her help. But the girl looked at him with a disrespectful look and replied that she was simply tired of this noise, so she did not help him on purpose. But the guy smiled and said that in any case, even if she didn't want it, she saved him, so he was still grateful to her. The girl then returned to her tea and said in a quiet voice that he really remained a coward even after so much time. After that, she called him a squirrel. As soon as the guy heard this, he was very surprised and asked why she thought so. But the sister explained that he was capable of becoming passionate even about some nonsense. However, as soon as something happened, he would immediately drop everything and avoid, hiding in his hollow without even trying to fight. Adam laughed nervously, but didn't respond to this, because he understood perfectly well that in essence it was the truth. But the woman asked him to dry her carefully. She said that he would not be able to protect anything if he constantly hid and ran away. She said that she had heard that his little daughter was quite smart. However, a Leo cannot be born from an industry deer, so she thought that she should not have raised her expectations too high. After a short silence, the woman said that it really bothered her. She was interested not in the forest of Adam's weak character, this poor child who should have had a bright future. The man did all this and thought about it seriously. He didn't answer his sister because he understood that she was right about everything, and because of this he felt sad. At the moment after school, Ferenthia went outside, and the twins immediately came to her because they wanted to play with her. She said that their rules remained the same. Do not leave the main rank, and dangerous or hard-to-reach places were prohibited. The boys immediately said that they understood everything and were ready to play. Then Ferentia said that she was starting to count, and they needed to have time to hide during this time. She began her report about the guy at the same time they ran away in order to find the best place so that she would not find them. But in fact, it was her cunning plan. She went into the forest and sat down under a Ferentia tree. She was very happy that there was finally silence. She was also glad that she was able to sit down because her legs had been hurting quite a lot lately. She was still planning to be alone for a while, and then she would go look for them when the time came. Well, then suddenly she heard some rustling not far from her in the bushes. Ferenda was very surprised. She did not understand who it could be. After all, it was believed that she was the only one there. She thought that at such a time there should not be any servants in this place. But then suddenly she saw a little boy who was dressed in a rather expensive uniform. He had light hair like wheat. She assumed that most likely they had a guest, and he simply got lost. Ferentia decided to help him. She turned to the guy and said that he shouldn't have entered this territory. Well, the boy, because he was immersed in his thoughts, didn't even hear her. He suddenly took his hat off his head and, throwing it on the ground, screamed loudly. As soon as the girl saw this, she was very shocked. She did not understand what was wrong with him at all and why he was behaving so strangely. He continued to scream and throw things around, and the girl decided that it would be better for her to pretend that she had not seen this. And then she got up and started to leave because she needed to start looking for the twins. But at that moment, the guy suddenly turned to her and shouted loudly, telling her to stop because he had already seen her.